A question people used to ask a lot was, where were you when the clones attacked? The answer in my case was shambling my way out the front door of a cantina on Coruscant. I can't remember the name of it, but I was thoroughly intoxicated. I was on shore leave, you see, and celebrating my promotion to the rank of captain by having one last crawl across the capital with the crew. The sun was just coming up, and I remember blinking furiously, dazzled by the morning light. Eventually, when my eyes and my general sense of balance had readjusted a bit, I noticed a small crowd beginning to gather around a nearby hollow emitter in the street. Usually those things just broadcast public service announcements and, one of the news channels on repeat. Most people didn't pay any attention because, frankly, the news at the time was always pretty grim. So, as you can imagine then, my curiosity was piqued merely by the fact that there was a crowd at all. Then I saw the images. It was all coming from Geonosis. You could see formations of clones running across the red dunes, led by Jedi Knights parrying incoming blaster bolts. Towering over them were these huge walkers, and the sky above was practically blotted out by assault ships. I mean, the news that we were at war would have been enough of a shock, but this new clone army? That was something else. Entirely by accident, I think I found myself standing next to one of my fellow lieutenants. He looked from the holonet, and then back to me, without saying a word. I don't think any of us really knew what to say. Although, in reply, I think I recall slurring something along the lines of, "Well, they kept that quiet, didn't they?" before I vomited all over his shoes. A little less than a month later, I found myself on the command deck of the Eternal Vigilance, my first command, one of the new Acclamator assault ships. Ostensibly a military transport, the Acclamator-class transgalactic military transport ship, to use its full title, was, in reality, the first of a whole line of vessels that would one day lead to the Imperial Star Destroyers we all know so well. It was a good, sturdy vessel, armoured with neutronium and equipped with enough turbo lasers to throw some good punches in ship-to-ship combat, while still managing to carry a full legion of clone troopers, along with their supplies and vehicles and aircraft. Even back then, though, there was something oddly oppressive about the things. Those grey interiors, completely drained of colour. All those identical corridors. I'm not too ashamed to admit that I got lost on my own starship a few times at the beginning. When I got my promotion, none of this was what I expected. I'd graduated from being the first officer on a Corellian corvette hunting pirates to commanding a warship in one of the greatest conflicts the galaxy had ever seen. It didn't take long to see why. When it became clear that the war was going to last much longer than that first battle on Geonosis, the Republic needed more ships, more crews, and more officers. Officers like me, with some experience, however little that might be. It would have been years before I'd got my own captaincy in peacetime, but there I was, staring out the window at the rest of the fleet. In my shiny new uniform, hands clasped behind my back, trying to look as dignified as possible. I was about to head into a trial by fire. All of us were. The first time we went into battle, it was above the hitherto peaceful world of Alderaan. The command bridge was silent as a tomb as the final hyperspace calculations were made. My first officer, Lieutenant Gerald Samick, stood with his back to the windows, watching the armoured clones working away in the crew pits, waiting for the nod when they were ready. If I'm honest, though, what I remember most in that moment was how sore my feet were. In the Navy's haste to outfit everyone with new uniforms, we didn't have time to get properly fitted for our clothes. In those early days, most of us were walking around with sleeves slightly too short, and every time we sat down, our jerkins would ride up in a slightly undignified manner. My problem in particular was my boots. I got a standard pair of one-size-fits-nobody officer's boots, and As we waited for the order to jump to hyperspace, my chief concern was my pinched toes. I suppose it was a blessing in a way. It kept me distracted from the interminable waiting. Alderaan was taken by the Separatists early in the war. It was a daring surprise attack led by Count Dooku himself that caused no end of embarrassment for the Chancellor as Bail Organa began raising hell in the Senate. Unquestionably, then, the planet had to be taken back, and quickly. I seem to remember at the time, though, there were some who still counselled caution, suggesting that Dooku had taken the planet merely as a bargaining chip, but Palpatine was having none of that, and neither were we. The Alderaanians were a peaceful, pacifistic people, and had done nothing to deserve invasion by the Separatists. So, under the command of the Jedi General Plo Koon, our task force was sent to take it back. We had no idea what we were in for. And suffice to say, when it was all over, and the casualties were counted, public opinion hardened against the Separatists, mine included. Working with the clones was a very strange experience. Lieutenant Samek and myself were the only two non-clone members of the crew on our little acclimator, and in the beginning, it felt like there were only 3 people on board. It's just the third one was constantly in multiple places at once. It had a curiously isolating effect on the pair of us. The clones kept to themselves, easily able to tell one another apart, somehow, and the lieutenant and I would spend the rest of our time apart from them. I suppose it ensured that my first officer and I had a very good working relationship, but it also meant I wasn't able to connect with the crew in the way I'd always done on past assignments. There was no animosity, though, you understand, a certain aloofness perhaps, but the clones were polite and obedient almost to a fault. As time wore on, I would get to know many of them, and eventually learn to tell them apart. At the start, however, after the Battle of Alderaan, when only half our troopers came back, I wasn't able to actually tell at first until I saw the official casualty statistics. It's hard to miss familiar faces when everyone's wearing the same one. I never found out the specifics of what happened down there. I didn't ask. It wasn't my business as I saw it. I was a Navy man and they were ground pounders. Never the twain shall meet, I thought. For the most part, I just felt lucky to be up here instead of down there. I figured that if General Plo Koon himself had fallen during the fighting, it must have been pretty bad. The fleet would have its own bloodbath very soon, but for now, I continued in blissful ignorance of the future, as we prepared to leave the system and regroup with the rest of the core fleet. The next few weeks were pretty quiet for us. We regrouped at Coruscant, building for a new offensive in the wake of the Alderaan disaster. Morale was, if I may say so, not very high at this point. The Senate was demanding action, a reprisal for recent events, and news that Republic forces stationed on Kashyyyk had come under siege as well did not improve matters. The real problem was that we simply weren't ready. But with political pressure mounting, the attack on Ferost had to go ahead regardless. And so we began preparations. A few further bits of news floated our way in the following days, including knowledge that the defenders of Kashyyyk, along with the local Wookiee population, had successfully repulsed the first attack by forces of the Trade Federation. A little after that, we also got word that the Separatist Admiral Trench had been captured in the Outer Rim after a cunning attack led by a certain Captain Dallin. We'd be hearing more from him in the coming months. As much of a boost as this was, however, it was still only a temporary reprieve. As the final preparations were made and our hastily assembled battle group was preparing to make the jump to lightspeed, I was informed by one of our clone officers that a second Separatist attack on Kashyyyk had commenced, before any major reinforcements could reach the defenders. In spite of my efforts to keep it hush-hush, word got around anyway, and we found ourselves heading into our first real fleet battle, with doubts nagging in the backs of our minds about whether this war was even winnable. It didn't do us any favours in the battle to come. The silence of hyperspace. Clicking and whirring consoles, hushed, identical clone voices, soft footsteps. And then, in the blink of an eye, astonishing violence. We hit real space on the Separatist flank, aiming to close in on their huge Lucahulk flagship and take it out as fast as possible. The stars were afire, with streaking turbo lasers, instantly. And even from my position at the window, I could hear the tinny scratching of the erupting intership voice communications from the clones' headsets down in the crew pits. I barely had a moment to marvel at the immediate spectacle before two of our lead ships exploded, and I realized our error. It was exactly that. A hyperspace jump miscalculation. We were arriving much too close to the Separatist fleet and getting bombarded before being able to fully raise our deflector shields. This happened a lot in the early days. We were still inexperienced, and that day at Ferost, it cost us. The rest of the battle itself is a bit of a blur, to be honest. In spite of everything, our crew worked with the efficiency of a first-rate crew on a drill. Orders were issued and carried out immediately, damage control teams reacting with incredible speed. Our gunners were hitting their targets with an accuracy I'd never seen from an ordinary human crew. It was this first big battle in which, for me, the penny finally dropped, and I began to appreciate just how good the clones were at what they did. If I'd actually had the time for superfluous emotion in the midst of the action, I might have felt proud of them. The battle was a defeat, as the history books clearly show, so I needn't go into any further details here, but we made the jump to hyperspace on a ship racked with multiple hull breaches, fires, a collapsed deflector shield, and a bridge filled with smoke. But we made it. The Vigilants would live to fight another day, and so did most of us. The Ferost disaster was a lesson for many reasons. It taught us a lot about tactics and strategy. It taught us what a real fleet battle actually felt like. And it also taught us never to underestimate the Separatists again. More importantly, however, as the grand scheme of things would show, it taught a great many of us that listening to the whims of politicians instead of the admirals would get a lot of us killed. That knowledge planted a very dangerous seed, which would be slowly cultivated over the following years. Things got pretty quiet for a while after Ferost. The core fleet was busy rearming, repairing, and refitting, and while the Separatists had won a victory, it was hardly decisive enough to allow them to go on the offensive. Most of the action was in the Outer Rim, where Jace Dallin was continuing to make a name for himself. Meanwhile, Gil Peleon on board the Leveler was in command of our task force, since he had the most experience among those of us still present. We got on well. Both of us were Navy men to the core, with each of us having served in the Republic Judicial Forces before the Clone Wars. A lot of the senior staff were understandably somewhat shaken by recent events, but he kept us going with his air of geniality, remarking more than once that while our situation was less than ideal, he did enjoy a challenge. I think once he said it enough times, we started to believe we did too. I won't lie to you, much of what I learned about being a commander came from Peleon. He was an inspiration to many of us at the time. He showed us that while we were down, we were certainly not out, and it was time to strike back. The Chancellor made a big show in the Senate of spinning the outcome of the Battle of Ferost as a cautionary tale for what might happen if the Navy was not simply left to get on with its job. And it certainly brought us some time free from political badgering. Some people might be tempted, with the benefit of hindsight, to claim that even back then they knew there was something off about Chancellor Palpatine, but they'd be liars. As far as we in the services were concerned, he was our man. He had our backs in the Senate, and we enthusiastically cheered him on. That's the truth, as uncomfortable as it might be. Our next assignment came shortly after we'd had most of the fleet back up to battle readiness. Pellaeon called me aboard the Leveler to discuss our next move in person, and explained that we'd be releasing some probe droids back into the Ferost system to assess the damage we'd done and what the Techno-Union's current strength was. The new droids were still prototypes, and while the real deal would be ready soon, for now it would require a single ship to hyperspace in, launch them from the hangar bays, and then get out of Dodge as fast as possible. As it happened, I, and the crew of the Vigilance, had been volunteered for this task. At least that's what Pellaeon said to me at the time, as he smiled mischievously through his moustache at me. I had the droids brought aboard right away, and after a quick inspection, since after all I did find myself curious, we were underway. The Force works in mysterious ways, if it works at all, because on this little scouting mission, we were about to discover something very interesting, which, had those droids been fully ready, we would have missed out on entirely. With the battle at Vulpter over, we had our first real victory in the core worlds. Pellaeon's restructuring of the battle group and our evolving tactics were beginning to see results, and we were informed that the Chancellor had extended to us his personal thanks. At the time, I just kind of shrugged and moved on, really. We weren't doing this for him at the end of the day, but the recognition was a boost to morale across the board regardless. The army was feeling better about things too. Vulpter was a textbook lightning strike. We had the Separatists surrounded and outgunned before they even knew what was happening. For the first time since the original battle at Geonosis, we got to watch the clones doing what they did best. Still, up in orbit, we weren't ignorant of our precarious position, and it wouldn't be long before we got orders to make the jump to lightspeed immediately to intercept an incoming attack at an axis. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were mostly just running around, dumping buckets of water on fires. We needed something more, some kind of edge against our better-equipped foes. Luckily, very soon, we were going to get it. It was around 14 weeks or so into the war that things really began to grind to a halt. We'd been promised new vessels, the contracts had been agreed upon with the various companies involved, and for now, we just had to hold the line. That was the story of the war in the core worlds back then. Hurry up and wait. The real action was on the Outer Rim, where Jace Dallin and a young Jedi by the name of Anakin Skywalker were both starting to become real poster boys for the war effort. I had yet to meet either of them at this point, as our forces on the frontier were cut off from the core entirely, but news of their increasingly daring exploits against the finest strategic minds the Separatists had to offer definitely alleviated the constant boredom of picket duty at Anaxes. We had our battles of our own to fight, of course, but we weren't grabbing headlines, you might say. Our earlier failures still hung over us like a bad smell, and while we were desperate to go on the offensive again, we simply didn't have the manpower, or indeed political power, to actually do it. When Admiral Yularen arrived to take command of the core fleet, it marked a turning point in the war. I can remember now, as clear as if it happened yesterday, looking out of the viewport as his Venator Star Destroyer hoved into view past the shadow of the nearby planet. Beautiful ship. Always was, always will be. There's an adage among starfighter pilots that if it looks right, it'll fly right. I don't know if that really applies to capital ships, but I'd like to think maybe it does. There was a fine piece of engineering with a thick hull, plenty of turbo lasers, and a truly massive hangar. It was a carrier, first and foremost, able to serve as the delivery system for whole swarms of Republic fighters. And as we quickly begun to learn, fighters win battles. With the arrival of the Venators, and our new Admiral to lead them into battle, confidence was high, and it only grew over the coming weeks. It was time to break the deadlock outside the core worlds, and we were going to do it in style. It felt good to be on the attack. Admiral Yularen didn't favour the philosophy of sitting and waiting for the enemy to come to us. Instead, he wanted us to be aggressive, and that suited us just fine. Especially the clone crews, who were practically bred to be on the attack. With the first of the gigantic Praetors finally refitted and ready for service, we were going to smash into the Separatists like a fist right on the nose. We'd obviously heard that the Confederacy was growing in size as more and more star systems continued to join them, and I think Yularen and the Chancellor were both hoping that in the midst of this expansion we could capitalize on some momentary lack of organization on their part and catch them off balance. As it turned out, they were both right. As the new Venators and Praetors rolled out of the shipyards, I have to confess our little acclimator was starting to feel a little bit outclassed, but morale was high, regardless. The clones were in good spirits, our pilots felt confident, and I was starting to really get to know my bridge officers. They were starting to show a lot more individuality, or perhaps I was only just starting to notice it myself. Either way, it was a positive change. Many of them started to do little things like change their haircuts, presumably to make it easier for the likes of myself to tell them apart. It was a very obliging gesture that Samek and I both appreciated. History hasn't been kind to the clones, and for good reason, if I'm honest. But I still remember them the way they were back then. Good soldiers. Good people, on the whole. We'd all have our fair share of sins on our consciences in the years to come, but I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll talk about that later. I think it was around the time that Wat Tambor was killed and General Grievous sent packing in the same week that people finally started to take the Republic seriously. The Navy wasn't messing around any longer, and as we left a string of flaming Separatist hulks in our wake, there was a definite sense that perhaps the Confederacy had bitten off more than it could chew. Obviously, these victories were given a lot of attention in the press, particularly the routing of General Grievous and his invasion force, which was good for morale both out on the front line and back at home. People were at least getting to see those taxpayer credits at work. Odd thing about that first battle with Grievous, though, at the time it was spun as a devastating and perfectly planned ambush, but, and I can say this nowadays, I have it on good authority that it was nothing of the sort. I used to know one of the Venator captains involved in the skirmish, one Runa Lurgo. She was just freshly promoted, and their task force was on its way to regroup with Tarkin's fleet in the Outer Rim. When they jumped into the system, they found the invasion force waiting for them, and nobody was more surprised than they were. Republic intelligence totally dropped the ball, and it was sheer dumb luck that we didn't lose the system. Of course, you couldn't tell the public that, but that's war. An awful lot of it, I've discovered over the years, consists of fortunate accidents that you can spin into moments of genius after the fact. Yes, I know. It's been a while. I could make some excuses about how my work with the Senate kept me too busy, but the truth is, I had a crisis of confidence. I wasn't sure if keeping this record going was a good thing. Digging up all the old ghosts in this day and age and reopening old wounds when we still have so many pressing issues going on right now. I guess when you put it all on a view screen, the Clone Wars really wasn't that long ago, but it feels like a lot longer. In fact, scratch that. It feels like ancient history. But anyway, I changed my mind. Or rather, some colleagues and friends changed my mind. They told me that if the New Republic was going to learn from the mistakes of the old one, then, well, someone was going to have to put those mistakes on the record. And, frankly, they're absolutely right. So, where do we leave off? My memory of the first year of the war, I have to admit, is a little fuzzy in places because I spent a good deal of it floating in a Bacta tank. It's a long story, so I'll try and keep it as brief as possible. Something that often gets forgotten these days is that back then, the vacuum of space and our own ships were, at times, a more formidable opponent than the Separatists were. Case in point, it was a little while after the first Battle of Telti that I had my first real brush with death. I've already mentioned before that my ship, the Eternal Vigilance, was an Acclamator-class assault ship. Well, the thing about these vessels was that they were some of the first to use hypermatter reactors. We use them on all sorts of starships these days, but back then, it was still relatively new technology and still had some problems. For myself and the crew, it was about to become a very big problem. A minuscule fault, at least this is what I've been told, in the main reactor chamber's bulkhead doors was causing, completely unbeknownst to any of us at first, a slow but steady leak of particles into the rest of the ship. Now, by the time the alarms went off, almost every deck below the bridge was quickly becoming hazardous to human habitation, to say the least. And given no option, I ordered the crew to make for the escape pods, or start getting off the ship in the clone troopers' lats, whatever was quicker. We would have happily left Vigilance to float in space as a leaky hulk, but there was one wrinkle that we realized as soon as the evacuation was underway. The leak was having an unanticipated but dangerous effect in the reactor core. It was producing a temperature imbalance, essentially, as the cooling system continued to dutifully work away at its usual rate, not accounting for the leaking matter. It was causing the temperature to go lower and lower, and when the hypermatter particles get to a low enough temperature, they destabilize. If it continued, it would result in a pretty catastrophic explosion, and, well, you may recall what happened to both of the Emperor's Death Stars. Well, this would have been a similar affair, albeit on a much smaller scale. The whole ship would have been atomized before most of the crew could get out, and before our neighboring ships in the fleet could even withdraw to a safe distance. So, there was only one thing to do. With the leak having fried most of our systems, someone needed to get to the reactor level and manually disable it. And by someone, I mean we needed at least 6 people or so to do the job quickly enough. I looked around at my bridge crew after explaining the problem. They all knew what it meant. Without me even having to ask the question, a handful of clones stepped forwards, bless their souls. I joined them. The way I saw it, I was the captain, which meant I had, by default, drawn the shortest straw. I won't bore you with the dramatics. I'm here talking to you now, so it's obvious we succeeded, but it wasn't without cost. Only a couple of the clones survived. The rest, who volunteered to go into the most badly irradiated areas, they didn't survive the trip back. They knew the risks, and they did it anyway. Of course, they were all like that, I think it must have been programmed into them somehow, that willingness towards sacrifice, but just because some Kaminoan made them that way in a lab doesn't mean I respect them any less for it. They pulled our semi-conscious bodies from the reactor control level, and likewise the Vigilance itself was pulled from the fleet and towed back to the Quat drive yards. My comrades and I found ourselves getting freshly acquainted with our own Bacta tanks, and as our lengthy recovery went on, so did the war. What went on in my absence is tricky to piece together, frankly. Records from back then are difficult to come by at times, and a galactic-scale war is, by its very nature, difficult, incredibly difficult to chronologize properly. Frankly, I leave that thankless job to the historians. All I know for sure is that by the time I was back on active duty, it seemed like very little had actually changed. I held a desk job for a while at Republic Intelligence, mostly in the euphemistically named Collections Department, where we got to work with captured Separatist technology. Take it apart, find out how much of it was worth keeping, and, ultimately find out how to more easily blow it up. I certainly valued my time spent there. I even learned a few useful things that would keep me out of trouble later, but as soon as I got word that Old Vigilance was shipshape again and my transfer orders came through, I could not wait to leave. The war, seemingly, had waited for us. Very stupidly, I couldn't believe my luck. While I was away from frontline service, the Republic made a few key gains, mostly out in the Galactic East, having recovered Kashyyyk and some of the surrounding systems. Our good fortune wasn't going to last long, however, as the Separatists had been carefully preparing a counter-offensive that would end up thoroughly knocking the wind out of our sails, to say the least. The core fleet was large enough now that it was split into two separate task forces led by Admiral Coburn and Admiral Yularen. For my part, I was back serving under Yularen again in Force Beta. In the coming weeks, the officers and the ratings both would start jokingly referring to our outfit as Chancellor Palpatine's Fire Brigade, as most of our time was spent dashing from system to system to put out the fires of the Separatist assault. Unfortunately, even our talented leader couldn't be in two places at once, and the enemy made some important breakthroughs in spite of our best efforts. Things were surprisingly quiet on the Outer Rim, from what we could tell anyway. Obviously, Dooku and his chums had decided that the core region was the most important and was focusing his efforts on us instead. Lucky us. As for my ship, the Vigilance was purring like a happy Rancor. The engineers at Quad had included a few extra bells and whistles in the refit, and while most of the crew had changed, most of them were clones, so if I'm honest, it didn't really make much of a difference. I also had a new first officer, Hila Brenko. She was a little green around the gills. A lot of the non-clone officers were at this point, since a lot of them had been promoted through dead men's shoes, as we like to put it. I remember one day, after more news of the Separatist assault came in, explaining to her that she shouldn't let the bad news get her down. After all, the enemy could keep up their hit-and-run game for a while, but eventually they'd have to face us properly if they wanted to make any real progress. She asked me what would happen if they did. I replied that, quite frankly, we'll clean their chronometers. I think she felt better after that. When I returned to the fleet, one of the big changes was its overall composition. For one thing, we had a lot more Venators, still coming fresh off the production lines at Quad. But the Republic Navy had also learned to love a punchy little ship known as the Arquitan's Light Cruiser. Now, I knew a couple of Arquitan's captains, and I can say with some certainty that those guys were always a particularly special breed of madman. I think you'd have to be, really, for that job. My humble acclimator was no queen of the skies, I can assure you, but it was more survivable than it looked. The little Arquitans, however, was very small and very under-armoured. Its advantages were its speed and a brace of turbo lasers and missiles that served to create a very mobile platform in an otherwise quite slow and ponderous war, really. We would typically group them into squadrons of 5 or so. And if the opportunity allowed, we'd send them hurtling off towards the enemy's rear to cause all sorts of havoc, either by attacking fleet tenders and star bases, or just simply attacking enemy vessels at their vulnerable stern. I sometimes like to raise a glass in private to the captains and crews of those ships. Few of them survived their own reckless antics during the war, and Even fewer survived Imperial rule. The Empire had no use for such independently minded and irreverent individuals, and for the most part those once mighty little vessels ended their days escorting transport convoys and putting down insurrections from orbit. And the Empire was very good at squandering excellent talent wherever it could find it. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself again, I'm afraid. Back to the Clone Wars. The Clone Wars came in a few phases, if you ask me. Points where the landscape of the Galactic War changed noticeably. We didn't realise it at the time, but we were on the precipice of another new one. I don't know exactly what was going on in Separatist territory. You'd have to speak to someone from their side if you can find one of them these days, but what I do know is that they'd seriously ramped up their ship production and droid manufacturing. What we'd previously thought was a counter-offensive on the core turned out to be more of a series of probing attacks compared to what we ran into later. At first, we in the core fleet were totally unaffected. Things seemed to be going well. We were taking ground and beating the enemy back, but in the Outer Rim, where most of the Separatist war production was taking place, our forces had started to run into unprecedented resistance. Reports came in from Tarkin and General Kenobi's task forces of vast armadas of Separatist ships assembling in the Outer Rim, including many more Lucahulk carriers than we'd anticipated. They'd even encountered new configurations of these ships that were swiftly dubbed Lucahulk battleships. This was a disastrous state of affairs, to put it mildly, and it wasn't long before the Chancellor secured additional funding from the Senate to begin production of more Praetors from the Quat Drive Yards, as well as the Mandator project. It was going to take some time before any of that got off the ground, and in the meantime, we would have to try and hold the line, and exploit the weak points in the enemy's defences where we could find them. Luckily, the ground war was going much better. Well, with the exception of Itho, anyway. Oh, you haven't heard of the Itho incident? Oh, okay, well, I suppose we'd better talk about that next. The Battle of Itho was a strange one. The whole thing got brushed under the rug, of course, and, covered up. Which I'm sure is why you've never heard of it, because the Empire wasn't any more willing to talk about it than the Republic was, but when the Separatists attacked, they threw an entire army at the place, and the Republic garrison valiantly held the line and pushed them back. Wave after wave of battle droids was sent to the scrapyard after being torn apart by blaster fire, saber tanks, and lacked airstrikes. And then, something very unusual happened. As the final wave of the attack ended, Republic sensors detected a fresh wave of incoming dropships, easily the same size as the entire force that the defenders had just fought like cornered animals to fend off. The commander, I forget his name, he didn't last long after the incident, unfortunately. Well, he made the decision in the face of certain defeat to scorch the Earth, destroy all Republic facilities on the planet, and evacuate what assets remained. They did so, his troops dutifully following his orders, making their way to the evacuation sites on the opposite side of the planet before blasting off and making the jump to light speed while the token Separatist task force in geosynchronous orbit could intercept them. The problem was, the attack ships the sensors had picked up weren't attack ships at all. They were a meteor shower. A big one, of course, of a kind very rarely seen in the skies of Itho, and it was enough to fool the sensor operators. The reality was that the Separatists were defeated. Their reserves of battle droids had been committed and subsequently destroyed, and while they had ships in orbit, they now lacked any remaining boots on the ground to secure the planet. The Republic made the dash to hyperspace, retreating from an enemy that was already defeated, as the Ithorians would soon discover. That was an embarrassing week for the Grand Army of the Republic. Luckily, the Navy was there to provide a suitable distraction. The battle at Vulpter was a damn close-run thing. In fact, I don't think we'd have been able to take those losses without losing face if it weren't for the fact that it emerged shortly afterwards that the Lucahulk carrier we took down was carrying Count Dooku himself. The Count escaped, of course, but it was a humiliating moment for him, and to my knowledge he never set foot on the battlefield again afterwards. However, that stroke of luck aside, it was clear our strategy needed to change. Task Forces Alpha and Beta were to rendezvous at Coruscant, and then together the fleet would begin operating as one large force again. We needed a big, blunt instrument to smash through the Separatists' heavily defended core holdings, and the combined core fleet would be our sledgehammer of choice. I should probably remind you at this point that Jedi General Plo Koon was actually in overall command of the fleet and the army, although at this moment was present only in the form of frequent holograms while he oversaw the marshalling of a new clone legion to accompany our campaign. There were some mixed feelings about that, I can tell you right now. The clones were quite loyal to Plo Koon, but for the pre-war personnel like myself, there was a sense of indignation. Our admirals and commodores we trusted. We'd served with them, they were proven commanders, and when they said jump, we'd asked how high on the way back down. So why was this robe-wearing mystic in charge? The Jedi had a reputation for being skilled warriors, peacekeepers, and diplomats, absolutely, but what the devil did they know about commanding fleets of Star Destroyers? The response to this conundrum varied across the Republic Navy, and largely seemed to depend upon which Jedi General they were assigned to. You see, many of them garnered great respect from not only myself, but a lot of my peers, over time. Others, though, well, many Jedi seemed to be little more than children, and yet we were taking orders from them. When you've got an admiral of 40 years' experience saying yes sir, no sir to a boy only just old enough to drink on some planets, well, it doesn't just engender resentment from the admiral, but from all his officers too. I think it's important that I explain this now, because what you need to understand is that the Empire wasn't built overnight. It didn't just pop into existence the day the Chancellor made his declaration in the Senate. It was built slowly, brick by brick, for years in advance. And at the time, not a single one of us noticed. I remember the second Battle of Ferost quite vividly. I'm sure a lot of us who served back then did too, actually. It was a point of pride, after all. It was the place where the Separatists had initially given us our first good hiding very early in the war, and it was not only a duty, but a pleasure to come back here later and see them reap the whirlwind. I also remember it for a different reason as well. I was an ambitious man back then. I had a career to think about, and it was my hope that soon I might be promoted to Commodore, and then, one day, even Admiral. As such, I took a lot of notes, and the section of my notes on Ferost is quite substantial. The system was guarded primarily by a Separatist IGBC gun platform, effectively a starbase built to house as many turbo laser batteries as possible, and serve the purpose of providing area denial to our capital ships. So, Plo Koon, Yularen, and Coburn agreed on a very different approach. We'd launch virtually all our fighter and bomber squadrons, send them to run the gauntlet of enemy defences, and let them do the hard work. The starbase had very little in the way of close-in defences. It was supposed to be supported by fighters of its own, but with the enemy's main fleet away, there were no Lucahulks there, and our Venators could put out enough squadrons to overwhelm them completely. The plan worked. The main formation made straight for the gun platforms, with escorts peeling off to engage any token resistance along the way. Once in attack range, even the hefty Y-Wings were able to deftly manoeuvre around the massive laser cannons and inflict enough damage to completely annihilate the station. Chaps like Adar Talon had previously suggested that starfighters could achieve some incredible things given the right resources and training, but this was the first example that I personally recall in which this philosophy was proven right. We didn't often get the chance to replicate it as the war continued, because the Separatist Lucahulks usually meant that we could usually only achieve parity in fighter numbers at best. However, what I saw from my command deck that day was something I considered revolutionary. This, to me, was the way of the future. And without wanting to toot my own horn too much, in later years, I would be proven completely correct. I think I might have mentioned this briefly in the past, but one of the things that made the Clone Wars such a harrowing experience for many of us was the droids. Battle droids were monstrous creations, if you ask me. You wouldn't think so just to look at them. You know, they couldn't shoot straight most of the time. They had this absurd, idiotic-sounding voice modulation, and they were very easily outsmarted, but there were millions of them. These things were mass-produced on a scale that defies human comprehension when you actually sit down to crunch the numbers, and in order to be able to do this, they had to be cheap, which meant that their programming was very, very basic, and that meant that their programming was very brutish and simple. They never gave up. I can't tell you how many people we lost because of that. Any living enemy would see sense when the odds were against them. They'd retreat or surrender, but not the droids. Even when any hope of victory for the Separatists was an utterly distant memory, these machines would keep fighting us. I remember at the Battle of, I think it was Deca Nemoidia, when an acquaintance of mine, serving as a naval liaison officer on the ground where the army was killed. He was 3 days away from the end of his tour, due to go back to Coruscant, have some medals pinned on his chest, and take some time to recover. But a damaged B-2, missing both its legs, crawled out from behind some munitions crates and detonated them with a rocket. The officer, along with several clones that were nearby, were all killed in an instant. The battle had been over for several hours, but the stupid machine didn't care. That's one example of probably hundreds I could recall if I actually wanted to. It happened to us in space, too. Separatist admirals would often see it as more advantageous to let their fleet of droid-operated ships fight to the death, while they made their own escape during the carnage. We could have them outnumbered 4-1, but we'd lose someone, a cruiser maybe, or another acclimator, because the droids were programmed to keep shooting and shooting and shooting, even as their ship broke apart around them, rather than strike their colours and surrender. We hated them. They were less than even just animals to us, and we took a serious and almost perverse pleasure in destroying them. People sometimes wonder why so few Separatist leaders were taken prisoner by our forces during the war, but I'll ask you this. If we hated the droids so much, how do you think we felt about the people who made them? In the core world, we had the Separatists on the run for a little while. However, things weren't looking quite so good in the mid and outer rim. To the galactic south, Tarkin was busy commanding a small fleet cobbled together from whatever was available, trying to prevent the Separatists from overrunning the Republic's last few outposts down there. It was a very static war, from what I'm told, with both sides being strategically cautious. My recollections of Tarkin from back then are mostly of him generally being quite an odious little man. Even though I think I actually agreed with him on a few points of general strategy, it was hard work to get past his general demeanour. His record during the Clone Wars was one of overall mediocrity, in my honest opinion, and it was obvious to a lot of us that his eventual promotion upwards came as a result of his connections on Coruscant rather than any genuine merit. He also found a friend in the form of Jedi General Skywalker, but that's very much a topic I'll get to later. In the Galactic East, meanwhile, things were rather more grim. Our fleet-based defences had been all but eradicated in the region, and those few ships remaining would be little more than a speed bump to the huge Separatist armadas coming out of their home territories nearby. The real battle up there was being fought on the ground on planets like Ruusan. It was of little strategic value, but since the defenders had nowhere else to go, they put up a fierce fight, and at this point had already destroyed one invasion force. The value of Ruusan was now mostly political, with the little dust-covered world becoming a fierce symbol of resistance toward the Separatist onslaught. The suffering of its defenders, as well as the civilian population, was well documented, and some accounts were even relayed on the Senate floor. What little support that could be provided via disused hyperspace routes was made available, but For the most part, Rusan was alone, and there was little that the rest of us could do but watch the news reports with anxious expressions on our faces. I remember the first time I saw one of the Mandator Star Dreadnoughts. It was certainly a sign of things to come and would be dwarfed by later vessels, but at the time, it was a real sight to behold. It had a way of completely filling a viewport in a way that usually only planets and moons did. The scale of it was almost too much for the human mind to comprehend properly. If you found yourself on its bridge, it was like looking out at an honest-to-goodness horizon. The Quat drive yards had built a few of these behemoths before the Clone Wars to join their own sector defense forces, and they had a few noticeable drawbacks. Galactic treaties were in place from many generations ago that meant that the vessels had a number of artificial limitations imposed upon them. Most noticeable was their speed, or lack thereof. Truly lumbering machines, they proceeded at an absolute crawl when at sublight speed, and considering how much of our command and control and logistical infrastructure these vessels ate up, it meant that deploying one of them kept the rest of the fleet in quite a defensive posture, trying to ensure that the vessel's big guns were protected at all costs. I didn't like it personally. It wasn't in my nature to gently float alongside like a glorified corvette, but orders were orders. Speaking of those big guns, actually, that was the other big limitation. For such a large vessel, its armament was very noticeably lacking in proportion to its overall size. Now, of course, it still had enough batteries to absolutely rip apart anything smaller than a Lucahulk, but for the amount of space it took up, it didn't seem worth it to me. Bearing in mind, of course, that at this time I was still quite obsessed by this whole new concept of starfighter superiority, and slowly trundling along with a gigantic self-propelled starbase ran quite contrary to the whole concept. There was another problem, too, that became very readily apparent on the Mandator's first deployment. The Separatists had come up with a sneaky, cost-effective, and altogether quite clever obstacle for the Mandator, which came in the form of large ion cannons built on the surface of their planets. They could, in a surprisingly short amount of time, strip away large chunks of the Mandator's impressive shields from a place of relative safety, and, well, there wasn't much chance of them missing such a gigantic target, was there? The consternation and frustration this caused among the fleet's command staff was palpable. For my part, I knew a good idea when I saw it, and I wrote down some notes about that, too. Fondor. Oh, there's some bad memories. By this point in the war, the Republic had almost entirely liberated the core worlds from any remaining Separatist control. To the galactic southwest, though, there remained a single, stubborn thorn of resistance. Its name was Fondor, Fortress Fondor as it came to be known. The planet was located in the Tapani sector and was famous for its massive orbital shipyards, similar to the ones found on planets like Quat, and just as Quat was a massive production centre for the Republic, the same was true of Fondor for the Separatists. As a result, they'd fortified it with a massive fleet, surface-based ion cannon batteries, orbital defences, the lot. It was very precious to them, and they were determined to make us bleed for it. This they accomplished quite well. The Mandator was slated to lead the assault. It was pretty much the exact purpose for which the vessel had been intended by the Republic Navy, a gigantic battering ram to smash very unsubtly into the enemy's defences and weather the damage of the counterattack while the rest of the fleet could safely engage and destroy enemy targets from a distance. A nice plan, in theory, but in practice it forgot one very important fact. The Separatists got to choose who they actually wanted to shoot at, and they weren't idiots. Our first rude awakening during the war was at Ferost, that battle we already discussed quite some time ago. Our second was at Fondor, and it proved to be particularly eventful for me personally. Admiral Yularen's funeral was a relatively private affair, as it turned out. Chancellor Palpatine wanted his body to be sent back to Coruscant, so a massive state funeral could be arranged. It was the first time many of us didn't see eye to eye with the Chancellor, but it was such a predictable request that Coburn made sure the burial at sea was already complete before the inevitable call came. We didn't want Yularen's death to be politicised, and we were quite convinced that it wouldn't have been in accordance with his wishes either. I'm sure Coburn got a dressing down from the Senate for it, but he didn't particularly care. A fair price in his view, and many of ours too. This was the occupational hazard of admirals, though. When the planning was done, and the jump to lightspeed was made, they were as vulnerable as the rest of us. Arguably more so, really, because any flagship would always be a priority target for the enemy. Yularen had escaped death on more than one occasion by a whisker, but the law of averages was bound to catch up with him eventually, and that day it did. Considering how many Separatist admirals had gone down in flames before him, though, we reckoned he had pretty good innings. At least he lasted longer than Trench. I reckon Yularen could rest easier knowing that was the case. I would often wonder in the years to come what he would have made of the Empire, or, indeed, what the Empire would have made of him. But, in truth, he was such a taciturn man when it came to his personal opinions that I really have no idea. Perhaps it was for the best that he died before everything went to pot, and perhaps much tragedy might have been avoided if he lived. Impossible to say. For my part, however, I had more pressing concerns to deal with at the time of his death. I never actually saw the Admiral's ship go down because at the time my own vessel was in the process of doing the same. The law of averages had finally caught up with us too, and as we were in position on the flanks of the Invincible, 2 Providence-class dreadnoughts got the Vigilance bracketed, and when the super-heavy turbo lasers started beating on our little acclimator's shields like a drum, I knew there wasn't much we could do. I'd seen it happen to other ships plenty of times before, so I knew how it was going to go down, but I cannot adequately express in words the terror of being under an attack like that. There is nothing that you, nor anyone else can do in that situation but either try and make an emergency jump to lightspeed, or just tell your crewmates that it's been an honour serving with them. It's rather like being singled out by a sniper on the ground, but I suppose the merciful thing about the sniper is that he'll get you before you know what's happening. Getting bracketed by a warship 3 times your size, on the other hand, it's like watching it happen in slow motion. The first hull breach was in the embarkation deck, which, at the time, was mercifully devoid of any ground troops. It was swiftly followed by multiple breaches right across the hull, bisecting the ship vertically across the prow. One turbolaser blast narrowly missed the bridge, and for a few seconds the entire deck was illuminated in blinding scarlet light. Our clone navigators were dutifully plotting a hyperspace jump solution, cool as cucumbers, while all of this was going on. But within a few seconds, the hyperdrive itself went offline, and I knew we'd finally had it. I gave the order to plot a course with thrusters away from any friendly vessels, and then sounded abandon ship. I was the last man off the bridge. I can take some pride in that at least, but there were plenty who didn't make it off in time. The bridge crew and I were some of the lucky ones, not only because we actually made it to the escape pods, but because our pod's trajectory took us towards the Mandator instead of towards the planet. There was this one very situational advantage to the Mandator, you see, and this was it. In enemy territory, a crew abandoning their ship could aim their pods towards the gigantic vessel, and provided you decelerated enough, you could land on its outer hull, where you'd be recovered by worker droids and some suicidally brave clone repair crews. About a quarter of us that made it off the ship ended up this way, while the rest of them went hurtling down to Fondor's surface. What became of them, I never found out. And it was primarily their fate that occupied my troubled thoughts during the hyperspace journey all the way back to the core. After Fondor, my career path took a somewhat unexpected new trajectory. I had an unofficial meeting with Admiral Coburn when he could finally find the time, and over some drinks he explained that he was impressed with me, and that under normal circumstances I'd be well on my way up the chain of command. The problem was that the sheer weight of attrition that was being placed upon the Republic Navy at the moment was creating problems in unexpected places, one of which was that we had a shortage of liaison officers to work with the army. With a sinking feeling in my stomach, I asked him to elaborate, and he explained that he would appreciate it very much if I would accept one such position until a new vessel and a new place could be found for me in the fleet. I was disappointed, obviously. I wondered aloud whether or not the position of liaison officer would be more suited to a lieutenant, but Coburn assured me that actually what they really needed was people with experience and talent for strategy, and that finding such officers was difficult because it was hard to tear them away from their existing commands. He regretted press ganging me like this, especially after just having lost a ship, but it was this very reason that I was the best candidate. To soften the blow, he intimated in so many words that if I should excel at my new job, he would almost certainly see me raised to the rank of Commodore. He had no doubt that I would excel, but the unspoken element was whether I would survive, as I soon would be going under the crosshairs of actual snipers instead of simply metaphorical ones. Not that I was any stranger to combat, but ship battles are by their very nature a lot more slow-moving and impersonal, at least until the hull breaches begin. Of course, the footsloggers on the ground probably thought my breed were a strange bunch, what with us willingly climbing into a tin can in a vacuum and then making a career out of having other people try to shoot holes in it. Regardless, though, the absolute truth is that the battles in orbit were solidly only one equal portion of the Clone War. And whether I liked it or not, I was about to find out how the other half lived. I couldn't have begun my new career as a liaison officer at a more difficult time. We'd successfully retreated from the attack at Fondor, but following this, command seemed to be paralysed by indecision over what to do next. We received, over the course of a week, multiple conflicting orders that were later cancelled or corrected that would have seen us heading back to Fondor for another attempted attack, or to retake Empress Teta, or to Mimban, before finally settling on Umbara. It was in the midst of this that I was acquainted with the squad of troopers assigned to me as a personal security detail from the 404th Clone Legion. The planetary assault on Umbara was about to begin, but even now, at the destination, chaos continued to reign as we received conflicting orders to board 2 separate transports, clearly issued by someone who didn't realise we were meant to be travelling together. This meant the squad ended up marching all the way to one end of the embarkation deck and then had to turn around and march all the way back again. And on a Venator Star Destroyer, that is no small distance at all, especially when you have to move through the existing throng of clone trooper platoons that are also dealing with similar problems of their own. When I met them halfway across, the sergeant was busy marshalling his men in a loud and unforgiving fashion, and was, in the finest tradition of NCOs throughout galactic history, reacting to a confusing situation by adding more confusion. He, who was only ever known simply as the Sarge to the troopers and Sergeant to yours truly, was an interesting fellow. He was stocky for a clone, a little wider than the rest, and also noticeably louder than the others, which I reflected was probably the reason they'd made him a sergeant in the first place. A good, shouty voice will always get you off to a good start in the services, and there were no exceptions here. He also had a habit of referring to all of his troopers by their full CT designation rather than by their nicknames, which was similar, I suppose, to the way the petty officers in my judicial forces days would refer to everyone by their surname. How he remembered all the numbers, I don't know. Must have been a clone thing. Like all good sergeants, though, he was also viciously clever and equally cunning. During our service together, I would learn a lot from him, even though I was his superior, and I'm sure in his estimation that made me a very good officer. Even though only weeks ago I'd been commanding an entire starship, the sergeant treated me as though I were the newest hapless lieutenant to fall into his lap in a long-suffering career. And from the first day until the last, this did not change. I would grow to both like and loathe him for this at the same time. As our LAT launched from the hangar bay and began its flight down to the LZ, I caught my first glimpse of the new Victory Star Destroyers out the window. They were big, brutal-looking ships, hanging in the vacuum like menacing granite arrowheads. In a generation to come, this iconic shape would come to inspire fear and terror right across the galaxy, but at the time, just some ugly-looking triangles, to be honest. At first, I'd been quite irritated that I was denied the command of one of these new vessels, though my temper cooled somewhat after it was quickly discovered that the attrition rate of the new victories was far and above any other type of vessel in the Republic Navy. They were not incapable ships by any stretch of the imagination, but they were constantly in the firing line, and someone important had clearly made a calculated decision that quantity was more important than quality in the construction of these vessels. Shortly afterwards, we made planetfall, and I was introduced to General Plo Koon, who was in command of the entire operation. Unlike myself, he didn't need a group of bodyguards. The lightsaber dangling from his belt was all the protection he needed. But far from being aloof and distant, he seemed to be very popular with his men, which surprised me at the time. Over the course of the following battles, I would grow to understand why they held him in such high regard, and I must confess that Plo Koon did a great deal to change my opinion of the Jedi Order, which until now had not been particularly favourable. We didn't have long to chit-chat though either way, because not far away, I could already see blaster shots whizzing across the oppressive purple horizon that we would all grow to hate on Umbara. Umbara was not a pleasant place. Virtually no sunlight reached the surface, which meant we spent our days in an eternal darkness, lit only by our lamps and the bioluminescent plant life. The planet was truly alien in every sense, without even an ordinary sunrise and sunset to mark the days as they went by. It was a maddening experience that I can only truly remember as a kind of blur, with all the memories smudged together, and I have trouble trying to figure out what the correct order of them should be. What I can tell you is that I spent my time largely behind the front line. Not that far behind, of course, but far enough that I was usually not actually being shot at, thankfully. As liaison officer, I had to coordinate the ground forces and the fleet together as a kind of middleman. Plo Koon called all the strategic shots, and I took care of the details. When it came to being schooled on the finer points of ground warfare, experience was my chief teacher, with the sergeant occasionally chiming in with some pearls of soldierly wisdom from time to time. I think the war on Umbara weighed heavily on General Plo Koon. He was popular with his troops because he valued their lives quite highly and understood that the best way to win a war was to take ground while losing as few men as possible. He'd muttered something appropriately on brand for the Jedi about treating the clones as people and not an expendable resource, but I think he was smart enough to know that fewer losses meant more retained experience and much higher morale. If you could keep the troops happy, keep them well trained, and keep them supplied, the job was already half done. At least that's how I saw it. But of course, as a wise man once told me, the art of war is mostly about figuring out what's on the other side of the next hill. And on Umbara, there was no way of knowing without resorting to the tried and tested method of picking a few men, telling them to walk over there and to keep walking until someone shoots at them. A war fought in territory like this was one of punishing attrition, and it made the general deeply unhappy at times, I could tell. The enemy were highly motivated, fighting as they were on their homeworld, and they knew the strange terrain much better than we did. They had some impressive technology too, but I think they were surprised by how relentless the Republic was. Our troops were the very best, trained exceptionally well, and had the benefit of a perfectly optimized genetic lineage that made the necessary whisker of difference in a contest with any ordinary man. More importantly, though, we were used to the droids, and there is no enemy more highly motivated than a machine that's been given some very simple instructions. When we would get the Umbarans surrounded and suppressed, it would almost come as a surprise to see them actually surrender. And while the environment we lived, fought, and slept in was a nightmarish place, we found the pace of the war, particularly under Plo Koon's calculating leadership, went quicker than might have been expected. Or perhaps it just felt quicker. We didn't have to eradicate every last one of them, after all. Eventually, the Umbarans threw in the towel after taking enough casualties, and I think for them, the price of surrender did not seem so high that they needed to carry on. It would, after all, be mostly just a return to the status quo from before the war. Or at least that's what they thought. They were wrong. I never saw the colossal space battle at Mimban, but I did see what was left of it. When the troop ships left hyperspace, we had to be guided through the debris field along a course marked by glowing buoys. The carnage outside was on a scale like I'd never seen before. There were shattered remains of Lucahulks, their ring sections broken apart, swarmed by the dead hulks of Kolovexes, gunships, and defunct droid fighters that were like shoals of tiny fish clustered around dead whales. There were Victory Star Destroyers in pieces, and others bizarrely intact save for a huge hole straight through the hull like it had been hit by a colossal cannonball. As we got closer to the planet, we could see the hulk of one of the Praetors, cratered all over and rolling over in the vacuum. Not so far away was another one, although this was still just about space-worthy, even though it was pockmarked with vented compartments, and even from a distance we could see the fires continuing to rage within its hull. Past all of it, once we got into low orbit, we realised that the planet itself had not been spared the destruction, as blazing impact sites from several hulks whose orbits had decayed littered the equatorial regions, the resulting desolation very much visible from space, as hundreds of kilometres of forest were set alight and continued to burn out of control in the drier regions. Our briefing had told us that the local Mimbanese were very much on our side, but I did think to myself that an awful lot of them must now have bigger problems on their hands than the Separatists. Mimban itself was a swamp. It was hot, it was wet, it stank even through the clones' air filters, and frankly, after coming from Umbara, many of us at this point were beginning to wonder exactly which higher power we'd offended so much. The sky was blue, at least. That made a nice change. It's just a shame it was filled with blood-sucking insects. There were times I was actually jealous of the clones, sealed in their suits, away from the insect onslaught, but my opinion quickly changed when I saw one of the rookies get one stuck inside, crawling around and biting him where he couldn't get at it. There was one important difference between here and Umbara, though, which worked in our favour. This time, the locals were on our side. I met frequently with my native counterpart, a liaison officer from the so-called Mimbanese Liberation Army. As far as I could tell, he just appeared to be a shabby-looking civilian with a blaster, but he was full of tremendously good ideas, and he taught us a lot about guerrilla warfare in the swamps and jungles. It was something the droids seemed completely ill-equipped to deal with, designed as they were to march across open field in a formation. The heat and moisture messed with their internal components along with their optical sensors, and their response time to any of our attacks was utterly woeful. All this meant that, mercifully, though Mimban was a tremendously horrible place to be, we didn't end up staying there a moment longer than we had to. I was drenched in sweat from head to foot, in clothes a week old, stinking to high heaven along with everything else on that planet, when we finally got our orders to re-embark for our next destination, Emberline. Were we not so exhausted, there might have been some cheering and punching the air at that news. Finally, we were going somewhere normal. Plo Koon met his end on Emberline. I didn't see it happen. As a liaison officer, I was mercifully left behind at the main staging area for the invasion. The city was, unbeknownst to us, riddled with carefully concealed anti-aircraft defences. Plo Koon's vanguard force made it to their objective, but the area was swarming with droids, and from what I can gather, his lat was shot down as they made the decision to pull out. And that was it. It was a very ordinary death, and I think the incident did a lot to shift people's perspective on the Jedi a bit. They weren't immortal, they were not infallible, and above all, they were just people, capable of being killed just like the rest of us. A lot of the mystery and magic of the Jedi went up in smoke along with Plo Koon when they cremated him, if you ask me, but either way, it was never quite the same afterwards. In the meantime, our own forces were plunged into a state of what I like to call disorderly stasis, as our Commander-in-Chief was now missing, and the chain of command attempted to untangle itself and interrogate which of the links in the chain was actually technically at the top. In hindsight, I suppose it was quite reckless of the Jedi generals to command in the way they did, assuming overall responsibility for both fleet and army, and then putting themselves in mortal danger on every battlefield we fought on. The nebulous position of authority they had only made things more confusing in their absence, as it did on Emberline. For my part, I felt particularly hopeless, as my job of coordinating airstrikes was made virtually impossible by the thick anti-air cover of the city. That left our forces with the job of fighting street by street, block by block, without air support, without a talented commander in charge, and all the while being bombarded by Separatist howitzers that were positioned outside the city limits. It became a meat grinder as the clones blundered forwards, falling one at a time to that particularly gruesome flavour of trial and error that is common to urban warfare. To make matters worse, we learned afterwards that a Separatist force had bypassed our fleet and once again landed troops at Mimban to try and cut off our supply lines from the core worlds. Spirits were low at that point. They rarely slipped any lower during the whole war. General Kenobi took over from Plo Koon, and with Emberline liberated, he ordered the army back to Mimban to deal with the Separatist strike force that had outmaneuvered our main fleet. The Mimbanese were less than impressed with the Republic as a result of this incident, but thankfully the battle was brief, with Kenobi leading an orbital assault on the main droid forward bases and eliminating the threat before they could fully reoccupy the planet. Following this, we moved on to Bothawai. There's not much to note here of interest, really. It's a textbook battle on the open plains. The droids had a massive garrison force in place, but they were ultimately no match for our heaviest firepower. Virtually all of it we were able to deploy without any problems in the rather forgiving terrain. Kenobi himself, much like his predecessor, spent a large amount of his time on the front line, leading the spearhead to the south. I wasn't present for any of that, but I'm told his skill as a Jedi Knight was displayed in style, to a standard exceeding even that of Plo Koon, who we'd all thought was an impressive warrior in his own right. Kenobi himself was an interesting individual. He had a talent for strategy, there's no doubt about that, but his demeanour was not what one came to expect from such a high-ranking member of the Jedi Order. At times, he was positively impish, like a disobedient rating working on the lower decks, with a wicked sense of humour. When the shooting started, though, he transformed, like someone had flipped a switch, and became the very model of a tight-lipped officer, straight from the finest academies on Coruscant. He had a lot of, well, humanity, for the lack of a better term, and he was by far my favourite of the Jedi generals I served under during the war. Still, the man was not infallible, as he would have been the first to point out himself. Several months ago he'd led the failed Republic assault on Druckenwell, and now with Bothawai back under our control, the Trade Federation Foundry world was again in our crosshairs. In the intervening months, the CIS had reinforced the planet with a massive fleet, along with all the usual orbital defences, as well as a substantial droid army in place on the ground. Kenobi and Coburn were confident of victory, but when the plan went into action, we were met with setback after setback as our initial fighter assault was repelled, with the few bombers that made it through discovering their torpedoes were equipped with faulty tracking systems. I believe there was an investigation later to determine whether this was an act of sabotage, but I'm not sure if it ever came to anything. Our second wave of the attack met with failure as well, with one of our two Praetors suffering critical damage to its hyperdrive and was left behind during the withdrawal. Then, finally, Coburn decided to commit all our reserves for one final withering assault. The casualties were colossal, and Coburn himself would have likely found himself in hot water had he not displayed the good grace to be killed when his own ship exploded. That might have been it for us, were it not for Adar Talon seizing control of the situation and salvaging it at the last moments. By the end, our fleet was decimated. We'd lost both Praetors, and the survivors were thoroughly shaken. I couldn't believe what had happened to myself at first, but soon it all made sense. Within the week, a fresh fleet of reinforcements arrived in orbit, including a new Praetor, Venators, Victories, and all the rest. With all these replacements, the fleet was back to full strength as if nothing had happened, and it was on that day it finally dawned on me what a war of attrition this had become. Coburn wasn't to blame, you see, and neither was Kenobi. The bean counters back home had, in all likelihood, already calculated that with our current rate of ship production, our chances of winning this war were growing with every passing day, and the Admiral had most likely been ordered to attack by decree of the Chancellor himself, in the knowledge that all of us were expendable. It didn't matter how many ships went down, how many crews were lost, how many clones were killed, because there was more on the way. There was always more on the way. Defeat was no longer defeat, it was a setback. and victory was no longer victory, but simply a hastening of the inevitable. It's much easier to see this in hindsight, of course, but it was obvious to everyone even then that the tide had turned. All you had to do was look at a galactic map to see that. The question now became how many of us could beat the odds and survive to the end. These thoughts, among others, occupied my mind as we began to embark on our transports for the ground assault that was yet to come. The Battle of Druckenwell was a difficult one. Our initial airborne assault was repelled right off the bat, with Fondor and his ARC troopers finding greater resistance in the target area than expected. This quick surgical strike denied to us, we had to wage war the hard way, with infantry battling through the industrial environment with its dizzyingly vertical terrain. Overhead, the toxic skies glowered down at us, and the disgusting green ocean stank to high heaven, just to make things even less pleasant. Once again, enemy air defences were thick enough that my role in the overall plan was greatly diminished once the ARC Trooper assault failed, so most of what I did was watching and learning as the clones bitterly fought their way platform by platform across the complex until eventually they were able to disable the droid's planetary shield generators. By that point, however, the battle was mostly over anyway, and it fell on me to simply call in a few token airstrikes to mop up the remaining Separatist forces that were stubbornly continuing to resist. On the bright side, we got some rest for a while afterwards, finally. We got word that Naboo had changed hands yet again, not long after the battle was over, but lucky for us, General Skywalker and the 501st Legion were being retaxed to deal with it instead of us. Good thing too, because our casualties over the last few invasions had mounted, and frankly I don't think we were in fighting shape after the last couple of months anyway. Fresh replacements were on the way from Camino already, but for now, we had little to do but enjoy the polluted wasteland of Druckenwell, oversee the rebuilding efforts, and wait. Jan Dodonna was an interesting man. During our period of downtime after Druckenwell, Dodonna was brought in to take command of the Outer Rim fleet, while Adar Talon was sent back to the core with a promotion. As a brand new commander, like always, he was at first an unknown quantity, but my initial impression wasn't a poor one, particularly since I noted his rather courageous decision to choose a Victory Star Destroyer as his flagship. This only improved after our first meeting, where he explained that he was aware that Coburn had promised me the rank of Commodore in exchange for my services as an army liaison, and he saw no reason to alter that agreement. Dodonna was a rare breed in the military, in that unlike many of the newest officers making their way to us from the academies on Coruscant, he was not a Palpatine loyalist. Even more than that, he was, like myself, someone who fundamentally seemed to believe in the rightness of our cause. Many people, even among those serving on our side, had come to take a dim view of the Republic as a political entity. It was to them the sick man of the galaxy, and there were more than one or two loud voices clamouring for sweeping changes. Dodonna, on the other hand, believed quite wholeheartedly in the democratic ideals of the Republic, and took his oath sworn to defend it very seriously. To him, the Separatists were not simply a threat to galactic order, they were anathema to everything good that we were supposed to represent. It is, I suppose, no surprise that he would go on to play the role he did in the future, and it's quite lamentable, really, that there were not more people like him serving in the Navy to begin with, else we might have avoided an awful lot of tragedy. At the time, though, the most important thing was that he was also a competent commander in addition to a moralist. He'd taken to the Victory Star Destroyer as a concept quite quickly and seemed to understand how best to use it to its strengths. While not wishing to speak ill of his predecessor, the casualty rate among Victory crews dropped by a significant margin after he took command. He wasn't one to wait around either. It wasn't very long after he arrived that he took the fleet and headed rimwards towards his first prize, the Separatist foundry world of Hypori. Our campaign came to a screeching halt in orbit above Geonosis. It was the place where the Clone Wars had begun, and now we found ourselves there again, staring down through viewports at the hateful red world below. There was some disagreement over how to proceed. General Kenobi was concerned about the sheer scale of the casualties we might endure if we tried to make an all-out assault. The Separatists had dug in hard on their most famous foundry world, with a massive garrison and plenty of defences in and amongst the Geonosian spires. It's no surprise, given how many top-ranking Separatist leaders were in attendance, but that would only make them more determined to defend the place to the last droid. The alternative solution, proposed by Admiral Dodonna, was simply to wait it out. Blockade the planet, move on, and let them starve. Proverbially speaking, of course, since droids don't starve, but the point was, why bang your head against a wall when you can just walk around it? This was all well and good, but privately I thought it was perhaps a bit risky to just assume that the Separatists wouldn't manage to somehow find a way to break the blockade from the surface. War is a game of chance a lot of the time, and I've never liked leaving the door open to unknown possibilities. Hedge your bets wherever you can, that's what I always say. But it wasn't solely up to any of us. Word had gotten back to Coruscant, so the Chancellor and the Senate were going to ponder the situation. It wasn't simply a matter of saving lives in the way Kenobi was concerned, it was a question of whether the government had the political capital to soak up the costs of an attack like this in the event of a worst-case scenario. I have to admit, rather selfishly, that as a liaison officer with the army, I was not relishing the idea at all. To my surprise, however, this part of my career was about to come to a swift end. I shared some drinks in a largely deserted officer's mess one evening with Dodonna, and as I was sipping genteelly on some Corellian whiskey, he broke the news that he was going to raise me to the rank of Commodore, effective immediately, and I was to become the new commander of a Victory Star Destroyer, the Conqueror. It required a superhuman effort not to douse the Admiral in a spray of expensive alcohol, but I just about managed it. As I forced myself to swallow, he noted with a dry smile that I shouldn't drink too much of it because I'd need to be up early tomorrow for the ceremony on board Conqueror's embarkation deck. After the initial thanks and congratulations exchanged hands, a moment of silence descended, broken only by the gentle clinking of the ice in my glass, and then I asked him, "Why now?" A dark cloud seemed to settle over Dodonna's face, and he seemed as though he was thinking very carefully about what the correct words to use would be. Finally, he said that he just had a feeling. He needed people he could trust at his back. He refused to elaborate further, and seemed to almost immediately regret having said anything, brushing it off jokingly as an old spacer's paranoia. At the time, I thought perhaps he was worried about getting blown out of the sky by the Separatists like his predecessors, and to be fair, he'd have plenty of reason to be worried about that. But Dodonna was, of all of us, the most in touch with what was happening with the government back on Coruscant, and as well as with what was going on in the rest of the Navy elsewhere. It was the first time, I think, that I saw someone begin to suspect that there was something rotten in the heart of the Republic, even though at the time I didn't realize it. Word came back from the Senate quite quickly. In fact, it came back just after I'd gotten settled in on the bridge of the Conqueror for my first shift. The Chancellor was ordering an all-out assault on Geonosis, and we were to spare no expense in the planet's capture. We were under some strict orders, though, to limit our use of orbital strikes and air attacks as much as possible, so as to ensure the preservation of as much of the Foundry infrastructure as possible. Our orders were oddly specific on that point. For whatever reason, our Commander-in-Chief wanted Geonosis' important facilities intact. It puzzled me at the time. Rathana was not far away, and already well set up as a Republic shipyard, and Camino itself was even closer. Still, ours was not to question it, and simply execute the Chancellor's directive. The plan was simple enough: deploy clone assault forces across the planet to secure all relevant infrastructure, following some initial raids by commandos. The open ground on the plains meant it was easy and necessary to deploy a large force of A5 juggernauts to support the initial landing parties as they moved to secure additional staging areas. General Kenobi would wait in orbit to begin with, instead of leading the vanguard, because he knew that the Separatists had some dangerous assets of their own, and he wanted to let them reveal themselves before swooping in to deal with them. He seemed very confident that he could deal with them, and I have to admit I had no reason to doubt him. I'd never known a Jedi Knight as skilled as he, though he was far too humble to say so himself. Our planning was meticulous, and our contingencies were numerous. Kenobi and Dodonna were quite determined not to let this operation become the bloodbath we all feared, and a lot of effort went into making sure that was not the case. Our secret weapon, though, in my opinion, was simply experience. When the clones attacked Geonosis the first time at the start of the war, they were not yet proven in combat, and their inexperienced Jedi commanders had even less idea of what they were doing. The clones, making their way to their dropships now, however, really knew what they were doing. They knew exactly what to expect, and that made all the difference. After the Battle of Geonosis, another period of downtime ensued. While Republic engineers went down to the surface to inspect the foundries, we did very little other than hang around watching. I ran lots of drills on the Conqueror, trying to keep the new crew up to snuff because I knew that however prepared they thought they were, it wasn't enough. I also got to know some of the captains under my command, all victory commanders themselves, and it was then that it struck me that I was dealing with the new Navy. These guys weren't Judicial Forces veterans like myself or Dodonna, they were a new breed. Not long out of the academies on Coruscant, often promoted with startling speed, and usually because they had connections. One or two I could more or less get on with, but by and large I didn't like them very much. They were a bloodthirsty lot, always talking the talk because they hadn't been given the opportunity to walk the walk, and amongst the worst of them was a sort of thinly veiled streak of cruelty. They treated me with the utmost respect, of course, but you saw it when they were dealing with their subordinates, particularly the clones. They weren't people to these guys, they were more like minions. And every single one of them was ambitious to a fault. I joked once to Dodonna that if I should ever turn up to a meeting with a knife or two in my back, would he please be kind enough to let me know? He gave me a knowing look in reply. After a little while, though, we were mercifully underway once again, headed for the absolute nadir of the galactic south, to the Separatist holdouts in Sullust and Mustafar, who had dug themselves in every bit as stubbornly as the Geonosians, if not more so, in fact. With Geonosis wiped out, our next big target was Sullust. It was one of two remaining big foundry worlds in the galactic south that the Separatists still controlled, the other being Fondor. The prospect was a grim one, considering how many new and untested crews and commanders we were leading into battle in those days, but the great war machine of the Republic could not be halted indefinitely. The political appetite for more and more victories back home was such that we had to mercilessly press onwards, and any thought of a negotiated settlement at this point was a distant and hazy memory. Luckily, we would at least get the chance to blood some of our crews at Nelvan first while en route, but our invasion plans were quickly scuppered when the Separatist General Grievous once again made his flamboyant presence known in the Outer Rim by attacking a string of worlds which included Bofor. Thus began several long planning meetings where Republic forces had to be shuffled around again to meet the emerging threat. Grievous had attacked us where it was obvious to do so. Kashyyyk and Ruusan were now heavily defended strongpoints by this point, and further down south the same was true of Rishi and Kamino, so he made his assault in between, where our forces weren't up to the job. This was Strategy 101, of course, not the work of a tactical genius, and the last thing anyone could describe Grievous as was a genius. But it only heightened the sense that we probably should have seen it coming. Dodonna got a lot of flack from upstairs about that, and unfortunately, that would prove only to be the beginning of his problems. The battle at Sullust was apocalyptic in scale, our casualties enormous, but we won the day. There were more enemy vessels there than our intelligence had led us to believe, and the Sullustans had been rushing out more and more ships in recent weeks to aid the defence with their impressive shipyards, all of which we blew to Kingdom Come in our assault. My part in the battle was rather limited, as my wing of victories was sent in towards the closing minutes of the battle to mop up the last of the defenders, and for that I am thankful. Admiral Dodonna was not so lucky. His flagship was attacked relentlessly by waves of Separatist bombers that, as usual, we could do little to stop in spite of the valiant efforts of the clone fighter pilots. The Admiral was recovered eventually in an escape pod with other members of his crew during the salvage and rescue efforts in the aftermath, though he was terribly injured. For all our sakes, it was a good thing indeed that he did survive, but at the time I was dreading what it meant for us. He was too unfit to command, and after such a costly battle, he would surely be replaced anyway, and unfortunately, that's exactly what happened. 3 days later, Tarkin arrived on the scene, the Chancellor's favourite, and my new commanding officer and Admiral of the Outer Rim Fleet. I've already stated my opinions on Tarkin before, so I shan't bother repeating them here again, but suffice to say, he was every bit as difficult to work with as I might have expected. He was surrounded always by sycophants, and I think he must have known I was close with Dodonna because he certainly kept me at arm's length most of the time. It was unpleasant, but for the moment I knuckled down and got on with my job. Tarkin had yet to prove himself incompetent as well as loathsome, so I did what I was told, and wished him success, mostly for my own sake. While our fleet was licking its wounds at Sullust, the Separatists, who had thus far only made some inroads into Bothawai, picked the perfect moment to begin a major counter-offensive. A string of important worlds were lost in a matter of weeks, while bruised Republic forces were forced to withdraw, most of whom were as battered as we were. The news couldn't be kept quiet for very long, and it soon started a political panic back at home. The Chancellor was pushing for more emergency powers to deal with the crisis, although by this point I had started to behold our former champion with a rather more critical eye than some of my compatriots. I can probably thank Dodonna for that. He instilled within me a healthy sense of scepticism and wariness that only seemed even more warranted when he was quietly disappeared from the fleet altogether after his replacement by Tarkin. Many years later, I was able to question him on the subject, and all he had to say was that as soon as his wounds were healed, he was ordered to return to Coruscant, where he would be transferred to an administrative role at the capital. There was no furious confrontation with his superiors, no quiet and disappointed chat with Palpatine, just an impersonally typed letter accompanied by his transfer papers. He was, in effect, simply tidied away to a location where he would hear little and achieve nothing. This happened a lot in the latter period of hostilities. Many former comrades of mine were dealt with in this fashion. Frankly, if I might address the Ronto in the room for a moment, we are all by now quite aware of the spectacularly violent way in which the Empire would later deal with its opponents, and indeed the way in which it has emerged in the years since that they dealt with the Jedi Order. The point I simply wish to make is this. For every person who faced a firing squad, or who was tossed in a labour camp, or who, indeed, earned the personal displeasure of Lord Vader, there was at least 100 others who were simply moved to one side, put in their place and forgotten about like papers in a desk drawer. Dodonna was among the first, but he was far from the last. Like most Separatist counterattacks, this latest one quickly began to run out of steam after the initial assault. Republic intelligence estimated that the Confederate economy was struggling, and after losing a string of important foundry worlds, it was becoming much more difficult for them to replace their increasing losses. This was very much the opposite case for us, with the big drive yards at Quat mass-producing new capital ships at a speed unheard of within living memory. Additionally, with the exception of Vulpter, the Separatist assault had ultimately failed so far to retake any foundry worlds, and even in Vulpter's case, a Republic force led by Jedi Master Yoda retook it very quickly. Politically, none of this looked very good for the Navy, of course, which only frustrated us more because we knew that in terms of the big picture, things were still shaping up well. In fact, Admiral Baraka of the Core Fleet had discovered that the recent Separatist assault had left their foundry world of Fondor quite lightly defended. Fondor had been a thorn in the Navy's side for much of the war. There had been multiple failed attempts to take it, and its presence next to the core worlds hampered our defensive efforts. Baraka, however, had a plan to deal with it, and he was about to get some impressive new hardware to do it with. We all love it when a plan comes together. That said, though, it's almost as satisfying to watch your opponent's plans fall to pieces, and that's exactly what was happening with General Grievous's offensive. While some of the gains the Separatists had made were impressive, what was more impressive was the speed with which we undid them. and by destroying their forces a piece at a time as we retook Republic worlds, it left them wide open to a push of our own. Fondor finally fell only a month into the operation, and from there a chain of planets fell in turn under our control as the remnants of Grievous's southern fleet was routed repeatedly. Their gambit had well and truly failed. Had they simply concentrated their forces on static defence, we would have undoubtedly had a slower and more painful time of it, but clearly their leadership was demanding a push for victory. Grievous himself was a craven general of exceptionally middling strategic talent, but I have to wonder just how much of this decision was his, and to what extent he was just making the best of a bad job. I don't know, and I don't know if we ever will for sure. It wouldn't be long before we had him cornered, for what we thought was hopefully the last time, but you never really could be sure with that wily old cyborg. You might have noticed lately, I've been talking more about broad strategy than any of my own specific recollections. Well, the reason for that is simply that I do not have many of interest to recall from this period of the war. My victory wing was now under the direct command of Admiral Tarkin, and Tarkin, well, let's just say he was content to direct the war from a safe distance at this stage. Considering what happened to every single one of his predecessors, I must admit that perhaps his caution was prudent. My subordinates were, as I've mentioned before, very much in the same vein as Tarkin philosophically. Virtually all of them were delighted with this appointment. The Battle of Sullust had knocked any misguided sense of bravery clean out of them, so being off the front line agreed with them quite well, and additionally, they all knew that Tarkin was very well connected with the Chancellor and the rest of the government back on Coruscant, and so they felt this was a very good move for their respective careers. The remainder of the old guard, like myself, well, we just tolerated it, I suppose. Personally, it was like having an itch that was impossible to scratch. I wanted to be out there making myself useful, but more importantly, it irritated me immensely that others were putting themselves in harm's way while I continued to sit idly by, fussing over paperwork. The sergeant and his troopers, who I'd taken on as a sort of personal security detail aboard the Conqueror, had it worse, though. The clones were bred to be on the front line, and having them sit here on their hands was like watching someone go through withdrawal symptoms. They occupied their time with relentless drilling and exercises, as well as intimidating the younger, more weaselly officers. A favourite game of theirs was to come up with inventive insults for many of my captains, sharing them over their helmet intercoms during briefings. I could hear this constant distraction over my own earpiece, but the rest of the room was privy to nothing but the occasional clicks of the clones' mics activating. The worst it got was when the Mandator was reassigned to Tarkin's personal command after some intense battles in the mid-rim. The lumbering behemoth lurched into orbit around Ariadu, pockmarked with scorched battle scars and chunks of missing hull, like a huge monster had been taking bites out of it. It only served to remind me of the important battles being fought elsewhere, and I suspect it only made the others even more keen to remain right here. It's quite hard to blame a man for being anxious about combat, but there is a difference, in my opinion, between that and the kind of craven attitude on display in this case. The war had, over the course of years, created a navy that was full of men and women that were as cowardly as they were cruel. In essence, exactly the kind of organisation that would have no problem bullying the rest of the galaxy during the peace. An overabundance of caution was admittedly not the only reason that my victory wing had been kept off the front lines, although that's certainly how it began. In the last months of the war, it became clear that the Separatists' point defence technology had come along leaps and bounds ahead of ours, and the Victory 1, with its missile and torpedo banks, had become obsolete in a shockingly brief amount of time. The designers at Quat were already in the initial phase of testing its successor, the Victory 2, which would serve a more holistic battlefield role, trading the missile banks for better armour, shields, and batteries of conventional turbo lasers. In a way, it was a kind of proof of concept for the later Imperial Star Destroyers that would soon follow, but in the meantime, the Conqueror and I were stuck with each other, with no hope of a refit anytime soon. The best we could do was focus our attack on enemy screening vessels, overwhelming their defences one at a time before moving on to the more important targets. It was far less ideal as solutions went, but improvisation is the name of the game when it comes to warfare, because everything is always changing, and it's amazing how quickly a new innovation or two can leave you in the dust if you don't keep up. I suppose there wasn't any great rush to get us refitted anyway, because the war was going very well for the Republic. The damage done by Grievous's final desperate offensive had been entirely repaired, and the remnant of the Separatist navy in the galactic south was cut off at both Mimban and Mustafar. Guarding the approach to the latter was our job, and since the Confederates weren't in any rush to leave their stronghold, it wasn't a very interesting one. The only guys seeing any real action at this point were the defenders of Rusen and Kashyyyk, as they continued to fend off enemy raiding forces probing our eastern defences. It seemed that the Republic's victory was all but assured, and you could tell it really was the case when the Navy was starting to consider upgrading older vessels to be of needless expense. As a matter of fact, shipbreaking contracts for scrapping a lot of the fleet once hostilities ended were already being drawn up. Somewhere on Coruscant, a Senate committee was already negotiating the end of the Conqueror's short career. And it must be said, there were one or two of us getting more than a little anxious that we might end up on the scrap heap too. So, here's a topic that might be of interest. The Republic was not the only one who had skin in the game when it came to manufacturing huge super capital ships. The Separatists took Mon Cala very early in the war, with the peaceful world being isolated from Republic reinforcements and totally unprepared to defend itself. Once they took over the place, though, they swiftly appropriated and even upgraded the massive shipyards there, which even back then were quite renowned among those in the shipbuilding business. They put the yards to good use, producing thousands of ships there over the course of the Clone Wars, but it was also where the CIS conducted a lot of shipbuilding tests and experiments. Towards the end of the war, the remaining enemy leadership was getting increasingly desperate in its attempts to find some way to, if not turn the tide of the war, then stem it enough to force the Republic to agree to a negotiated settlement. Unfortunately for them, their research and development was riddled with Republic moles, making it leakier than an Ugnaught fuel tanker. All sorts of fascinating and strange designs for ships and droids crossed our desks at Fleet Command, very few of which we ever ended up encountering in the field, but there were a few exceptions, and the largest of them, quite literally, was the Subjugator-class heavy cruiser. I don't know why they called it a heavy cruiser. Presumably it was an attempt to confuse our own intelligence-gathering efforts, although it failed because we knew about its existence very early on. It was designed by a Sullustan shipwright called Ruggel Schmong, and we actually captured a half-finished prototype of the vessel when Admiral Dodonna's fleet occupied Sullust. It was a massive dreadnought of roughly comparable size to one of our Praetors from Quad, but it was armed with a pair of so-called mega-ion cannons. The cannons themselves weren't yet installed on the prototype, but we found out about them later from Republic intelligence. With the loss of Sullust, the Separatists moved future production of the vessels to Mon Cala, and at last, in this late stage of the war, they had a couple of finished ships, and unlike so many of the Separatist crackpot projects, this one was about to actually meet us in battle, as the enemy made an attempt to break the blockade of the Mimban system and rescue their trapped southern fleet. Mon Cala and their talented shipbuilders would, of course, play a very important role in future events, but this lesser-known, forgotten curiosity is something I felt worth noting. As for how the battle with the Subjugator itself went, well, I'll get to that in a moment. The campaign in the Galactic South was finally coming to an end. Admiral Talon's fleet had the enemy cornered at Mimban, and the last Separatist holdouts at Mustafar had nowhere to go. After weeks of inactivity, our own fleet was now making preparations to move out. It was set to be one of the biggest battles of the war, and certainly the largest formation of Republic ships ever assembled. The theatricality of the occasion was entirely intentional. Outside the viewing ports, Star Destroyers stretched away into the night as far as the eye could see until they became indistinguishable from the curtain of stars behind them all, and the news crews were, of course, lapping it all up. We had orders to assist them as much as reasonably possible too, because it certainly didn't hurt our cause to let the people at home, and by that I really mean the people of the core worlds, know what their taxes were paying for. I was summoned to a private audience with Tarkin himself around this time, and I remember it came as quite a surprise because we had nothing scheduled. I stepped into his ready room, and after exchanging some very brief small talk and some paperwork, Tarkin, staring out of the window, asked me what I thought of the Separatist alliance. I didn't answer for a moment. I wasn't really sure what to think. This felt like some sort of test, and I hated tests. I decided to just be honest. I told him that I thought they were a glorified band of intergalactic criminals, that for the sake of avoiding just and fair oversight from Coruscant, a cabal of some of the richest people in the galaxy had plunged us into chaos and a war on a scale hitherto inconceivable because they put their own greed over the needs of the Republic as a whole. Tarkin considered this for a moment, and then he asked me what I'd give to stop them. I told him, honestly at the time, not really thinking through any of the ramifications, that I'd give anything. That restoring the peace and ensuring that something like this could never happen again was our duty. At last, he turned around, offering me a thin, ghoulish smile. "Thank you, Rigel," he said. "That'll be all." Upon much later reflection, I realized that it had been a test after all, and as far as Tarkin was concerned, I'd passed. Change was in the air after the Battle of Mustafar. For one thing, the Galactic South was finally secure, and all our efforts were moved several sectors north and east, but more generally, there had been for a while now a building consensus that the Republic as we previously knew it was not going to be around for much longer. I don't think anyone on any side of the debate really disputed this fact. It was more a question of what was going to replace it. Sweeping reform was coming, but from whom and from which direction was still up in the air. The proverbial protein paste was out of the tube now, and nobody could put it back in. In my arena within the Navy, prevailing opinion was that tighter, more centralised control of Republic space was an absolute necessity in the interests of preventing another war, and in effecting the kind of political change that would be needed to make a tangible difference to the lives of citizens in the long term. But just what that difference would be, of course, changed depending on who you asked. A lot of it, too, came from a fairly selfish place. A strong navy with tight control of Republic systems was a nice thing to have if you already held a commission with the Navy and wanted to ensure you still had a job to do after all this was over. Let's not forget, there was no Republic Navy to really speak of prior to the war. There was the tiny judicial force that I served in, and not much else. The primary motivation of a lot of high-ranking officials in supporting the new order was entirely symptomatic not of any strongly felt political views, but came more from it simply being a case of a huge new institution trying to justify its continued existence. There were already conversations happening about what the Republic was going to do with the vast and expensive clone army at its disposal once this was all over, and I think it had a lot of the new career military types a little nervous. Speaking of change, this was around the time that we saw the first of the new Star Destroyers begin to appear on the front line. The Imperator, the culmination of earlier work on the Victory class, made its presence felt as its distinctive silhouette hoved into view over the fleet. I heard originally it was going to be designated the Victory 3, but when the project changed significantly enough in size and scope, it was renamed. Technically, it was a different class of warship to the later Imperial Star Destroyers, but visually it was virtually identical. It was a very visible herald of the end times as far as the Old Republic was concerned, though this would only become quite so obvious with the benefit of hindsight. I was actually on Coruscant when it all went down. I got sent back there after the Battle of Mustafar to be awarded my Republic Seal of Service medal. The Star of Coruscant, specifically. It was originally supposed to be presented by the Chancellor himself, but he was apparently occupied with important business, and so St. Pistage did the honours instead for myself and a selection of other recipients. I was stood at the end of the line, and when he got to me, he paused and inspected the medallion for a moment. He smiled a curious sort of smile, though there wasn't any humour in those sunken eyes of his. "The last one," he remarked, strangely, I thought at the time. Then he placed it around my neck and moved on. I spent the rest of the day visiting some of my old haunts around the capital, including that old cantina in Uskru district that had stumbled out of the day we invaded Geonosis. It was filled with off-duty clones now. I didn't end up staying very long. Later that evening, I was at Admiral Dodonna's official residence for dinner by his invitation, along with a few other familiar faces. He might have been banished to relative obscurity back here at the capital, but he was certainly well catered for in his salary. The main window had a superb view of the city skyline at sunset, and although you could quickly get used to it if you spent enough time in the capital's spires, I do remember it being particularly breathtaking that evening. It was some time after nightfall, I think, that we started to notice something strange was going on. Outside, we could hear the roar of Lat gunships, far more frequent than usual, and in much larger numbers. We collectively ignored it at first, and then it slowly became impossible not to. The drinking and smoking stopped. People started making calls. Then there came a curfew warning on the building's security system, and not long after that, every commissioned officer in the room simultaneously received a Priority 1 general alert on his communicator. That's when we really knew something was up. We hadn't got one of those since the day war was declared. There was a boom from outside, and any other night I might have mistaken it for thunder. From down the hall, someone cried out, "I say, chaps, come and have a look at this!" In moments, several captains, a few commodores and the admiral were all crammed into the latter's tiny bathroom, jackboots squeaking on the marble tiles as we peered out of the small window. It had a decent view from the opposite side of the building. In the distance, we could see the Jedi temple, haloed in searchlights from gunships, blue tracers dancing around it like a concert show. An occasional explosion blossomed and faded, the delayed boom reaching us moments later over the distance. Silence reigned in the bathroom. Then the Admiral stepped out into the corridor. I didn't hear what he was yelling into his communicator exactly. I was far too distracted by the ongoing spectacle, but he didn't sound pleased. There was a long pause, and then he lowered his tone, and eventually the call ended. He came back in, and everyone turned to him, waiting for the inevitable explanation. "Contingency Order 66, he said, simply. Everyone, myself included, remained impassive, not having the foggiest idea what the Admiral meant by this, but also not wanting to admit it. Putting us out of our misery, he elaborated by explaining there'd been an attempted coup. The Chancellor had been attacked, but was alive, although grievously wounded, and the Jedi were involved to some degree. He didn't have any more details than that at the moment. The army was playing its cards very close to its chest while things were unfolding, apparently, and didn't care to share any details with us. After a little while, we all filed out, back into the dining room. Most left the building. Some stayed, silently imbibing a few last drinks in complete silence, either scrolling through data pads of documents relating to Order 66, trying to find out more, or just staring blankly into space. I don't think anybody really knew what to say after the initial excitement. I also think everyone was a little afraid to express an opinion. I knew there were some in the room for whom there was no love lost between them and the Jedi, while for others, like the Admiral, the opposite was true. Was there any anger? Any rebellious thoughts? Private suspicions? Possibly. Me, personally, I just drank up the last of my Sullust Red and went home. The one thing I knew for certain was that it would be an early start tomorrow, and with the mother of all briefings to follow. Like a lot of terrible mistakes, the Empire seemed like a good idea at the time. There was a lot of sympathy for the Chancellor, of course. To every onlooker, it seemed quite obvious that the assassination attempt had truly, horribly disfigured the man. Look at it from our perspective. As things stood, there had been a failed coup. The Jedi were seemingly guilty of all charges, considering the terrible fight they'd put up, with very few of them submitting to arrest without violence. In many cases, they even killed a number of troopers and officers in the process. A colleague of mine, Captain Brenko, who you may remember was my second-in-command on the Vigilance, died in the process of apprehending one of them. As you can imagine, any sympathy we might have had for the Jedi evaporated very quickly. Felt as though we were the ones who'd been betrayed, and hardly the other way around. Or so it seemed. Yes, we were aware of reports in which the clones opened fire without trying to make an arrest, but most of us knew from battlefield experience how dangerous the Jedi were, and so we could hardly blame the troopers for erring on the side of caution. Was it difficult to believe that every single one of the Jedi were in on the conspiracy, including the ones I'd personally met? Well, perhaps a little. Sometimes you just don't really know a person as well as you think you do. The Jedi's apparent treachery was just one more unlikely event in what was now a few years of consecutive unlikely events strung together. And how much you could really trust people who are able to play literal mind tricks on you is, well, it's up to you, I suppose. The alternative, this idea that it was all part of some grand conspiracy masterminded by the Chancellor using mind control chips and some sort of ancient sorcerous rivalry between the Jedi and their evil counterparts. I mean, do you have any idea how ridiculous that would have sounded? How it still sounds? But, none of those rumours would begin bubbling to the surface for years yet anyway. Was it concerning that the Chancellor had seemingly installed himself as a dictator? Yes. I don't think that sat well with a lot of people, but I think the general understanding at the time was that it might be a temporary arrangement of some sort. Or rather, the position of Emperor would have some sort of new constitutional basis. After all, the Senate hadn't gone anywhere. Not yet, anyway. Under the circumstances of the current emergency, it seemed prudent not to let politics get in the way of security, and lest we forget, there was a massive Separatist fleet still lurking around the hyperspace routes to Mon Cala, where the shipyards had been very busy indeed. There was a war to be getting on with, and as silly as it might seem, many of us were simply far too busy to worry about what was actually going on back on Coruscant, light years away and remote as it was most of the time. I might have had an accidental front row seat to the Jedi Temple siege myself, but I was hardly the norm. The transition itself was a smooth one. We kept all the Republic markings and insignia to begin with. Presenting an image of stability and continuity was felt to be important. However, I won't pretend that people weren't eager to put on that fresh coat of paint. It sent a message to the enemy, first and foremost. The kid gloves were coming off at last. Mercy, such as it was out the window. We were finally going to be given license to put these scum down, with a blank check from the Emperor to do whatever we needed to get the job done. Our assumption at the time, I'll remind you, is that the Jedi had defected, and that this latest development was a final, desperate Separatist plot to end the war in their favour. Well, we weren't having that. The Imperial Navy was the mightiest fleet ever assembled. We were the best of the best, the finest officers and men to ever sail the stars. Our long arms stretched across the galaxy from the core to the outer rim. No challenge was too great, no battle too hard, no mission too difficult. It was hard not to get swept up in all the rhetoric back then. It was time to put the remaining Confederates to the sword, end the war, bring peace and order to the galaxy, a phrase that quickly became repeated very often, and make sure that all our fallen brothers and sisters hadn't died in vain. That last point was an important one. It was those ghosts hanging around over our shoulders that kept us going for a long time. We had to bring peace and order to the galaxy, so that the massive list of names and numbers on the memorials meant something. It took a very long time for some of us to realise these ghosts would be ashamed of us. And some of us, well, they never did. The honeymoon period didn't last very long. The first purge began within a fortnight of the Emperor's proclamation to the Senate. Now, the regime removing people it didn't like wasn't anything new by this point, but while previously difficult officers would be reassigned, now they were being publicly dragged away. We started getting visits from the much-feared men in white coats, the Imperial intelligence officers that would swiftly go on to form the ISB. What surprised me was that a couple of men under my command were taken away, and I'd always thought them to be a fanatically loyal bunch. Stranger still was the fact that I managed to keep my command. Much of the old guard that hadn't already been tidied away in the preceding month started to disappear pretty swiftly. I can only assume that it's because I had a good working relationship with Admiral Tarkin, and that made me part of the club, so to speak. As I've said, I never liked the man, but did my absolute best to foster a working relationship with him in spite of this, ever since he took over after the Battle of Sullust. I knew which side his bread was buttered on, and even back then I figured it was probably a good idea not to get on the bad side of the in-crowd. It's worth noting that my career pretty much stalled at that point. I was neither considered disloyal enough to be removed, nor committed, ruthless, nor ambitious enough to be promoted. It's strange to think about now. When the Clone Wars began, I was absolutely determined to climb the ladder of command, but by this point, that was what might be euphemistically called seasoned. I mostly just wanted to keep my job, get the war over and done with, and make sure I lived to retirement. My family is from Chandrila, and virtually all of them were incredibly anti-war and incredibly anti-empire. My sister once called me an authoritarian pig when I was visiting home, and that was when we were still the Republic. My parents were a little more supportive, but I always got the impression they didn't approve of my choice of vocation very much, which naturally is exactly why I chose this job as a young man in the first place. Some newfound wisdom had tempered that earlier attitude, but it did little to heal the familial rift. It arguably made it worse, in fact. I visited home once after the Empire was formed, and it ended in such a furious shouting match that I left straight away and didn't return for 5 years. On the one hand, my family, like many Chandrilans, were appalled by the Emperor's seizure of power, and I, in my Navy uniform, stepping off an Imperial shuttle, had become the face of everything they feared and hated. It's one thing to have a black sheep in the family, but when that black sheep holds an Imperial commission, commands a wing of Star Destroyers, and is personally acquainted with some of the most dangerous men in the regime, it must be terrifying at worst and infuriating at best. Meanwhile, I was a war veteran who'd gone through so much and been put under so much strain that I just didn't have time for this kind of bickering anymore. Any patience I had was blown to smithereens, along with much of my victory wing in orbit over Sullust. Any kindness or understanding had been trodden into the mud on Mimban. The perpetual twilight dangers of Umbara had left me with an inability to sleep in a room without a light on, and now, of course, we could add to all of that the paranoia of the men in white coats arriving at the door of my ready room with the deceptively gentle words, "Sir, if you could come with us, please." It only took one passive-aggressive comment at the dinner table, and I practically exploded on the spot. If I'd had my sidearm, I think I might have even shot someone. The thing about arguments like that, though, is that sometimes, days, weeks, or maybe even years later, you realise that the other side was probably right. My pride meant that I didn't speak to my family again for nearly half a decade, but it didn't take quite as long for me to realise that they had a point. And as the purges went on, as the orders coming across my desk became more and more objectionable, it became increasingly impossible to deny it. At the time, however, I was just delighted to be back with the fleet. Destroying battle droids was something I could deal with. War had, somehow, become my comfort zone. Not the abstract concept, but the day-to-day business of it. I never felt quite as at ease That's when I was chatting with my clone security detail or pondering a tactical hologram. There were an awful lot of clankers still to be put out of commission, and I was keen to just get on with it. The air was thick with tension as the fleet marshalled for our assault on Seleucami. I'd gotten settled back in on board the Conqueror very quickly, and found myself with very little to occupy my time during the wait. I remember one day I was sat in the briefing room, idly reading a datapad while the sergeant, leader of my clone security detail, sat opposite. He was fiddling around with his lightsaber. The power cells were removed for safety's sake, but he was messing around with it anyway, flicking the buttons on and off. A small black market economy of sorts had sprung up in the wake of Order 66. Jedi memorabilia was a popular commodity, not only among servicemen, but back on Coruscant too, among the ridiculously wealthy and collectors. I don't know exactly how the sergeant had got his hands on one, or what he'd traded for it, but I wasn't interested in asking. I believe I remarked that it was tremendously morbid, and as usual, he had a reply. He pointed out that he'd be quite happy to turn it in as confiscated goods just as soon as the Empire decided to start paying him and his brothers a proper wage. As you can see, it's never a good idea to argue with your NCOs. Eventually, we were finally ready to get underway. Seleucami was set to hopefully be the last big battle of the war, with the gathered might of the First Fleet under Tarkin ready to smash the Confederates to pieces. With the vast majority of their shipyards in the galactic north now safely in Imperial hands, they could no longer afford to replace their losses. They still weren't to be trifled with, though. The bulk of their fleet was made up of mass-produced Dreadnought-class Providence cruisers. It made sense. The Providence's design had its origins in the shipyards of Mon Cala, and that's exactly where most of these were produced. It wasn't a perfect design, but the ability to produce so many of them, by standardizing all their production around it, made them a formidable opponent. We were still confident of success, but unbeknownst to us, Imperial intelligence was about to establish its long-running tradition of catastrophic failures by woefully underestimating the size of the enemy force. I can't recall who the Separatist admiral was. For all I know, it could have even been one of those tactical droids, although you'd be hard-pressed to find a high-ranking Imperial whose pride would allow him to admit that one of those trash cans had outsmarted him. Regardless, though, whoever they were, they'd managed to hide a large part of their fleet in a nearby collection of asteroid fields, and the natural metals in the rocks hid their presence from our sensors. It's the oldest trick in the book, really, but in our arrogance, we fell for it all the same. By the time we were in firing range, we slowly began to realize that we were facing an enemy fleet that was twice the size of our original estimates, and by then it was too late. The Battle of Seleucami was every bit as decisive as we'd expected, insofar as it decisively destroyed most of the First Fleet and the entirety of the Separatist one. Of my victory wing, only 2 ships survived. My flagship, the Conqueror, along with the Electo. Both were heavily damaged. We had at least fared better than Admiral Tarkin, however, whose ship was obliterated by a masterstroke of a flanking attack by the droids. Tarkin himself survived, but the incident gave birth to a lingering rumour, which was spread throughout the Navy, that he had begun making his way to an escape pod at the very first sign of trouble, leaving the ship's captain on the bridge to manage the hopeless situation in his absence. Tarkin would later be promoted all the way to Grand Moff, because being well connected was more important than competence in the New Order, but these rumours would dog him for the remainder of his career. One might speculate that this is the reason he refused to flee his imminent destruction many years later, but we'll never know for sure. We'd start to miss Tarkin very soon, however, because while he was recalled to Coruscant, his place was taken by Lord Vader. Vader was an inscrutable mystery to most of us. Allegedly, he was one of the few members of the Jedi Order that had sided with the Emperor and aided in thwarting the coup. However, nobody had ever heard of him before, and word of a sinister cybernetic Jedi would have certainly gotten around during the war. Nobody, however, was stupid enough to ask questions. This man, if you could really call him such, had the highest possible favour of the Emperor, and he also did not suffer fools gladly. A number of executions were conducted in the wake of the battle, and Vader carried out the sentences personally. At least that was the rumour. I met him precisely once. There was a big staff meeting after he took command, and I remember that he did very little speaking himself, while an adjutant laid out the agenda. Meanwhile, he seemed to stare blankly at the assembled commanders as if he was getting the measure of us or something. Mercifully, it didn't last very long. Compared to Tarkin, Lord Vader was a very impatient man, it seemed. The offensive was to roll on immediately, in spite of our massive losses, with new reinforcements arriving from Coruscant within the week. I wouldn't be there to see it, however. The Battle of Seleucami would be memorialized as a trial by blood for the Imperial Navy. It was, in the minds of the fanatics who would soon come to dominate the service, a necessary sacrifice on the altar of the New Order. A demonstration of our superior strength of will and commitment to the Emperor. In reality, it was something of a culling. Not necessarily by design, although I have my suspicions. A large number of the casualties included veteran commanders from the Clone Wars, as well as judicial service and sector defense fleet people like myself. My own survival was something of a statistical anomaly in that respect, but nevertheless it seemed my presence was no longer welcome because I was being transferred to the Outer Rim. I was no longer a Commodore, mostly because the ranks were being reorganised. In practice, nothing changed, but my title was now merely that of a senior captain, and while it wasn't technically a demotion, under the circumstances it definitely felt like one. I was to take command of an anti-piracy task force operating out of Ryloth that consisted of the Conqueror and a couple of supporting frigates. With the war winding down to a conclusion at last, the Navy was able to start freeing up assets to police Imperial territory more effectively. Criminal activity had flourished in all the chaos, and shipping lanes had become utterly treacherous for commercial and private traffic. Ryloth is situated right at the end of the Corellian Run, one of the biggest hyperlanes in the galaxy, and was an ideal place to base our operations from. After the initial shock of the reassignment, I have to admit I settled into it quite nicely. This was not so very different from the work we used to do in the Republic Judicial Force, and now I had a Victory Star Destroyer to do it with. Small task forces like mine became incredibly common, usually led by a Victory, Venator, or Imperator. The Vics, Vens, and Deuces, as they came to be called in the general military vernacular. I also had a lot more freedom and independence to conduct operations the way I wanted to in this role, rather than being part of a battle line following specific instructions from the admirals. And to top it all off, there were far worse places to be stationed than Ryloth. I was about as far as it was possible to get from my estranged family on Chandrilla. The climate agreed with me, and I was back to doing a familiar job with a mountain of resources that we could have only dreamed of back in the day. A lot of former Imperials look back fondly at this period, and it's easy to see why. We were high on success, the war was nearly over, and our new pirate and smuggler opponents were frequently as inept as they were unprepared to deal with us. Meanwhile, in the galactic north, the last pushes into Confederate territory were underway, and while a part of me felt a little guilty for not being there to do my part, if I'm being totally honest, it didn't bother me that much. I'd given my pound of flesh, and I thought I was entitled to a back seat now. It was time to help establish some of that peace and order everyone was talking about, and while at first it went pretty well, it certainly didn't stay that way. At an end, the Clone Wars were. To my total surprise, I actually received an invitation to the Victory Parade on Raxus Secundus, but I declined, citing important work that I did not wish to become distracted from. It's usually a good excuse to use. It hadn't taken very long, but I was already quite tired of all the pomp and ceremony of the new regime, and the big victory celebrations were really just an unpleasant reminder of how many we'd lost since it all started, and how the very fabric of the society we'd gone to war to protect in the first place was now utterly changed, almost beyond recognition. Did I feel any differently about the Separatists now that all was said and done? Not particularly, if I'm quite honest. Those among their ranks were misguided at best, and monsters at worst. They might have found themselves on the wrong end of the Empire, but that didn't make them good. and I've always continued to resist any attempts to rehabilitate their image over the years. Many of their leaders were tyrants who thought nothing of unleashing chemical and biological warfare on civilian populations, nor of bombarding cities, nor of using their legions of battle droids to exterminate any dissenters among the citizens of newly conquered planets. I do not miss them, and I have always spoken out against working with the remnants of that regime. I don't mourn their loss, but I do mourn everything we had to lose to beat them. Out on the frontier, we had plenty of time to think over these things. Life was routine, slow, and a lot less dangerous. On the Conqueror's Bridge, I was like the ruler of my own little kingdom, far from the politics of the Corps, running things the way I saw fit, and trying to forget about whatever was going on outside the purview of my own assignment. Times continued to change, as did the technology. Smugglers and pirates quickly discovered that our little interdiction mines were relatively easy to escape or simply destroy, and so they began to be replaced by immobilizer cruisers and the larger interdictors. Our grip on the big hyperlanes became absolute, with our quarry soon retreating into the warrens of less well-charted routes from whence they'd crept during the war. This game of cat and mouse went on without conclusion, and it was foolish to expect one. You might as well declare war on the wind or the tide. You can keep it under control, but it's folly to think you can eliminate it entirely. When the Conqueror was in port for resupply, I frequently retired to my personal residence down on the surface of Ryloth. I'd been afforded my own villa, out on the rocky mesas, where there was a little peace and quiet to be found, even if it was policed by a small garrison of Navy troopers while I was in attendance. It wasn't lost on me that, in spite of the fact that the Republic had come to the planet as liberators during the war, we were now lording over the place like victorious huts of old, even if it was from palaces of cold steel rather than red brick. The war had done no general favours for human-alien relations, it being a simple fact that aliens made up the vast majority of Separatists. The few megacorporations that had remained loyal to the Republic, like Tagco and Sinar, were human-led, and naturally had been rewarded with much of the seized assets previously belonging to the likes of the Trade Federation. However, the Empire's state-enforced anti-alien attitude was beyond mere prejudice. Alien members of the military, many who had served with distinction, were unceremoniously expelled. And they didn't stop there. Rumours abounded of exactly what was going on out there for a number of years, but it was made frighteningly obvious when security briefs started using the term strategic extinction in relation to uncooperative alien species. It didn't take long for the Twi'leks on Ryloth to start reorganising into their insurgent militias, and frankly, who could blame them? 10 years after the end of the Clone Wars, I was instructed to lead an anti-piracy task force into the Gorla system. It was the Conqueror's last hurrah before being sent for mothballing. I was given to understand a brand new deuce was going to take on the Conqueror's name afterwards, some sort of experimental model, though I never found out much about it. Gorlas is located not far from Ryloth and is host to a massive asteroid belt that's known as Smuggler's Run. I'll let you guess who typically lived there. We'd received a tip-off as to the location of a pirate base in the field, and we set off at once, taking on board 2 companies of stormtroopers for the job. We found the base, neutralised its defences, and the troopers went down there in shuttles. A few hours later, it was all over. The clean-up came afterwards, and a lot of body bags came back up. The ISB wanted them for identification, which was a little unusual for pirates, and the personal effects of the pirates were also gathered up and preserved. I had to pull rank to get a look at them, despite the protest of a black-clad stormtrooper lieutenant. Amongst the large collection of detritus, carefully gathered together and organised, were notes. Simple paper ones, mostly, scribbled in ordinary handwriting. They were virtually all letters to loved ones. Apologies, explanations, simple wills. Mother and father. I apologise for leaving, but I felt it was the right thing to do, that sort of thing. The common theme was that they all spoke of rebellion, and judging by the names, they were all Twi'leks. I'm sure the incident got me put on a list somewhere. I was never formally reprimanded about it, but 9 years later, still being stuck in the Outer Rim, still a senior captain, now in command of a diminutive little strike cruiser, I might add, it was rather obvious that someone didn't want me going anywhere. In the meantime, the fires of rebellion had spread from isolated cells of insurgents and terrorists to open military action, and the high-profile defection of Mon Mothma from the Imperial Senate to join the rebellion. No longer could it simply be dismissed as a scattering of malcontents, Confederate holdouts and pirates. It was organised, growing by the day, and almost 19 years since the formal surrender of the Separatist alliance, I found myself thanking my lucky stars that my career hadn't gone anywhere important, because the cream of the Imperial Navy was blown to smithereens. Who had masterminded this incredible rebel victory? This astonishingly unprecedented defeat for the Empire? Who had done with 30 snub fighters what a fleet of destroyers would have failed to accomplish? My old commanding officer, of course, Jan de Donner. I'd always thought he'd like to have seen Tarkin blown up after what happened at Sullust during the war, but never in a million years did I think he'd actually do it. I couldn't help but smile. In the wake of the incident, the Imperial military became subject to a witch hunt from the highest to the lowest level. The ISB began a purge the likes of which we had never seen. Even I, out in the arse end of nowhere, received a visit from an officer in the now ubiquitous white coat. I was asked to present the agent with a list of names from my own crew, consisting of people who had expressed any discontent, alien sympathies, or rebellious behaviour. I looked the young man directly in the eye. He was a whelp. Couldn't have been more than a small child by the end of the Clone Wars. Raised by Compnor to be a fanatic, and now here he was, on my bridge, sneering at me. I knew what I was going to do the moment the datapad was in my hands. Perhaps I should have stopped and reconsidered the implications, but honestly, the thought never occurred. I tapped out a single name on the list and handed it back. It was my own. Let me tell you, the look on his face, all by itself, nearly made it worth it.